Hello story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It all started on a cool autumn evening, a night just crisp enough to bite through my jacket, but not cold enough to keep me indoors. The world outside felt subdued, like the air itself held its breath. My name is Michael, and if you ask my friends, they'd tell you I have a bad habit of letting my curiosity take me places it probably shouldn't. That particular evening, my buddy Trevor and I had just wrapped up an uneventful dinner at a little diner we frequented. It was one of those places that felt like it hadn't changed since the 1980s faded booze, clinking silverware, and the faint scent of grease that never quite left the air. After paying the check, we walked outside, the orange glow of the streetlights stretching our shadows long across the pavement. Trevor was the kind of guy who always managed to make a mundane conversation entertaining. He had a knack for storytelling, though his stories often involved something ridiculous or borderline dangerous he'd done. That night, his stories didn't seem to hold my attention as they usually did. My focus kept drifting to the towering silhouette of an old, abandoned building in the distance, a place we had both heard stories about but never visited. The building was an old factory, long closed down. People in town said it had been empty for decades. It was the kind of place kids dared each other to go into, with broken windows that seemed to watch the world pass by, and a sagging roof that threatened to collapse under its own weight. Some said it was haunted. Others swore people still used it, though no one could agree on what for. I'm not superstitious, but the factory had always intrigued me. It was something about the way it loomed over the neighborhood, a forgotten monument to another time. That night, as Trevor kept talking, I found myself saying, "Let's check it out." He stopped mid-sentence and grinned. "You're serious?" "Man, that place is a dump." "Yeah, I'm serious," I replied. "You've talked about that place enough. Why not actually see it?" He hesitated for a moment, but shrugged. "All right, but if we find a raccoon or something in there, you're dealing with it." We headed toward the factory, walking through the quiet streets. The further we went, the darker it seemed to get, the streetlights thinning out until we were left with only the faint glow of the moon to guide us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be there. It wasn't fear, exactly more like a nagging sense that we were stepping into something we weren't meant to. By the time we reached the building, the world felt utterly still. The factory stood there, lifeless and hulking, its entrance partially blocked by a rusted chain-link fence that had long since given up trying to keep people out. Trevor and I climbed over the fence with little effort, landing softly on the cracked concrete below. "Looks worse up close," Trevor muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond. I was too busy taking in the sight of the place. The windows were jagged, like broken teeth, and the door hung on its hinges at an awkward angle. Graffiti covered the lower walls, crude drawings and faded tags layered on top of one another. As we stepped inside, the air changed. It was cooler, heavier somehow, and carried a faint metallic tang that I couldn't place. The ground was littered with debris, crumpled cans, shattered glass, scraps of paper that rustled faintly in the breeze, sneaking through the cracks. "Let's stick together," I said, not liking the sound of my voice echoing in the cavernous space. Trevor smirked but nodded. "Yeah, no wandering off. Got it." The first few minutes were uneventful. We walked through what had probably been the main floor, shining our phone flashlights over rusted machinery and piles of rotting wood. It was eerie, sure, but nothing I hadn't expected. But then, something caught my eye. A single chair sitting upright in the middle of the room, far away from any of the debris. It looked strangely out of place, its wooden frame perfectly intact, the seat clean enough to sit on. "Do you think someone actually comes here?" Trevor asked, his voice low. I didn't answer. I was too busy noticing something else. Next to the chair, a small stack of papers. Not random scraps, but neatly arranged sheets that looked far too new to belong in a building like this. "Okay, that's weird," Trevor said, stepping closer. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. As we approached, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The stillness of the room felt oppressive, as if it were holding its breath. And then, as if to break the silence, there was a sound. A faint creak, like weight shifting on old wood. We both froze, our flashlights darting toward the source of the noise. But there was nothing there. Nothing yet. The faint creak echoed in the cavernous space, lingering just long enough to set my nerves on edge. Trevor and I stood there, flashlights pointed in the direction of the sound, our breaths shallow and barely audible. "What was that?" Trevor whispered, his earlier bravado fading. I didn't respond. My heart was pounding too loudly in my ears to form a coherent thought. For a moment, we stayed frozen, two statues in the dim glow of our phone lights, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The factory was silent again, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as though the air itself was waiting for something to happen. "Probably just the building settling," I said finally, though I wasn't convinced. Trevor nodded, but his expression betrayed him. He was nervous too, though he wasn't the type to admit it. "Yeah, sure. Old places like this make weird noises all the time." We both tried to act casual, but the atmosphere had shifted. The space that had once felt eerie now felt menacing. Every step we took seemed louder than it should have, the crunch of debris underfoot echoing in a way that made me wince. We continued exploring, our flashlights cutting narrow paths through the darkness. The chair and the stack of papers still weighed heavily on my mind. Who had brought them here? And why? As we moved deeper into the building, we stumbled upon what looked like an old office. The door was missing, and the room beyond was cluttered with broken desks and rusting file cabinets. One desk, however, stood out. It was clean. I don't mean clean in the sense of being free from dust. Nothing in this place was but clean in its organization. The papers on top were neatly stacked, and there was a pen lying perfectly parallel to the edge. "Okay, this is weird," Trevor said, voicing what we were both thinking. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight over the desk. The papers looked new, their edges crisp and unmarked by time. They were blank, as far as I could tell, but the fact that they were here at all was unsettling. "Maybe someone's been squatting here," I suggested, though the words felt hollow. Trevor didn't reply. He was staring at something on the floor, a footprint. It was faint, but unmistakable, a single outline in the dust. And it wasn't one of ours. "Did you step there earlier?" Trevor asked, his voice tight. "No," I said, shaking my head. "We haven't been in this part of the building yet." We stared at the footprint for what felt like an eternity, neither of us daring to move. It wasn't just the presence of the footprint that unnerved me, it was the direction it was facing. It was pointed toward us, as though whoever had left it had been standing there, watching. "We should go," Trevor said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else entirely, a sense that leaving now would be a mistake. Before I could respond, there was another sound, louder this time. A soft, deliberate shuffle, like someone dragging their foot across the floor. We both whipped our flashlights toward the noise, but again, there was nothing there. "Did you hear that?" Trevor asked, his voice rising slightly. "Yeah," I said, my throat dry. "I heard it." The shuffle was followed by a faint tap, as though something hard had struck the concrete. Then silence again. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing through the empty space. No answer. Trevor grabbed my arm. "I'm serious, man. Let's get out of here." But before we could take another step, something happened that made my blood run cold. The stack of papers on the desk began to shift. At first, it was subtle, a single sheet fluttering as though caught in a breeze. But there was no breeze. Then, as we watched in stunned silence, the entire stack toppled over, scattering across the desk and the floor. Trevor swore under his breath, pulling me toward the doorway. "We're leaving. Now." I wanted to follow him. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, but my feet refused to move. I kept staring at the desk, my flashlight beam trembling as my hand shook. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the others, slipping through the doorway at the far end of the room. "Michael!" Trevor's voice broke through my trance, and I turned to see him already halfway out the door. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran after him, my pulse racing as we made our way back to the main floor. When we stopped to catch our breath, Trevor turned to me, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we weren't alone in that building, and whoever or whatever was there didn't want us to leave without knowing it. But instead of heading straight for the exit, something compelled me to keep going to find out more. "I think we should look around some more," I said, my voice barely steady. Trevor stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "You're kidding, right?" "After what just happened?" "I need to know," I said simply, though I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find. Trevor hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, but if something else happens, I'm out of here." No questions asked. We pressed on, the oppressive silence now accompanied by the faint sound of our own breathing and the occasional creak of the floor beneath our feet. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard another shuffle, followed by that same tapping sound. It was fainter now, as though whatever was making it was moving further away. I glanced at Trevor, who gave me a look that said, "Are you hearing this too?" I nodded. The further we went, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. It was almost tangible, a weight pressing down on us from every direction. We reached another room, this one filled with old machinery. Most of it was rusted beyond recognition, but one piece stood out, a large, cylindrical tank with a thick metal door. The door was ajar. Inside, something gleamed faintly in the light of our flashlights. Trevor stepped closer, his apprehension replaced by curiosity. "What is that?" We peered inside, and what we saw made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was a stack of photographs, all carefully arranged in a neat pile. Each photo was of the same thing, the chair we'd seen earlier, but from different angles, as though someone had been circling it, documenting it. And in the final photo, there was a figure sitting in the chair, shrouded in shadow, its face obscured. Trevor backed away, his breathing heavy. "We're done. Let's go." This time, I didn't argue. But as we turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone in that room. As we retreated from the room with the photographs, the air grew heavier, the kind of weight that pressed against your chest and made it harder to breathe. The factory was alive with a silence that no longer felt passive. It was charged, electric, like the moments before a lightning storm. Every creak, every rustle seemed amplified, resonating through the walls as though the building itself was alert to our presence. Trevor walked ahead of me, his flashlight cutting erratic paths through the darkness. He was muttering under his breath, though I couldn't catch the words. I knew he was trying to calm himself, to rationalize what we'd just seen. "Look, Michael," he said finally, his voice trembling. "That footprint, the papers, the photos, it's all just someone messing with us, right? Some kind of elaborate prank." I didn't answer. The logical part of me wanted to agree with him, but deep down, I knew better. Pranks didn't leave footprints in dust that had been undisturbed for years. Pranks didn't create the suffocating sense of unease that was creeping through my veins. We reached the main floor again, the vast expanse of crumbling concrete stretching out before us. I was about to suggest heading for the exit when something caught my eye, a faint glow emanating from one of the hallways to our left. "Do you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Trevor turned, his flashlight beam dancing over the walls until it landed on the faint light. It wasn't the harsh, artificial glow of a bulb. It was softer, almost warm, like the flicker of a candle. "Great," Trevor muttered. "Now we've got lights in the middle of nowhere. Perfect." Despite his sarcasm, I could see the fear in his eyes. Neither of us wanted to investigate, but the alternative, walking away without answers, felt impossible. We moved cautiously toward the hallway, our footsteps slow and deliberate. The glow grew brighter as we approached, and soon we could make out the source. A single lantern, its glass smeared with grime, sitting on the floor in the center of the corridor. "Who leaves a lantern like that?" Trevor asked, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. I crouched down, examining it without touching. The flame flickered inside, impossibly steady despite the drafts that whistled through the building. Beside it, I noticed something else, scraps of paper, scattered as though someone had dropped them in a hurry. I picked one up. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, almost frantic, as though the writer had been in a state of panic. The words didn't make much sense, just fragmented phrases. "It watches. Always watching. Don't turn your back. Don't stay too long." Trevor read over my shoulder, his face pale. "What the hell is this? Some kind of warning?" Before I could respond, there was a sound behind us, a soft, almost imperceptible shuffle, like fabric brushing against concrete. We spun around, flashlights aimed at the hallway we'd just come from. It was empty. "Michael, we need to go," Trevor said, his voice rising. I nodded, but something about the lantern kept me rooted to the spot. Who had lit it? And why had they left it here, along with these cryptic notes? As if in response to my thoughts, the flame flickered violently, casting erratic shadows on the walls. For a brief moment, one of the shadows seemed to move independently of the others, stretching and bending in a way that defied logic. Trevor grabbed my arm. "I'm serious, man. Let's get out of here." We left the lantern and the papers behind, hurrying back toward the main floor. But the factory wasn't done with us yet. As we walked, the temperature seemed to drop, the air growing colder with each step. My breath formed faint clouds in front of me, and Trevor's teeth chattered audibly. "This place is messing with us," he muttered. "It's messing with our heads." We passed the chair again, and this time, something was different. The papers we'd seen scattered earlier were gone, the floor beneath it completely bare. Did we clean that up?" Trevor asked, though we both knew the answer. "No," I said, my voice barely audible. A loud clang echoed through the factory, the sound sharp and metallic. It came from somewhere to our right, where an old staircase spiraled up into the darkness. "I'm not going up there," Trevor said immediately, taking a step back. But something about the sound drew me. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a pull, a compulsion I couldn't explain. "I just want to look," I said, already moving toward the stairs. Trevor groaned but followed, his flashlight shaking as he climbed behind me. The stairs creaked under our weight, each step threatening to give way. The higher we went, the darker it became, the faint light from the main floor disappearing entirely. When we reached the top, we found ourselves in what must have once been an office space. The walls were lined with broken windows, their jagged edges framing the night outside. In the center of the room was a table, and on it sat a single object, a photograph. It was the same chair, but this time, the figure sitting in it was clearer. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its posture unnatural. The face was still obscured, shrouded in shadow, but the sight of it made my stomach churn. Trevor backed away, his voice trembling. "I'm done. I don't care what's going on here, I'm done." But as he turned to leave, the door we'd come through slammed shut with a deafening bang. The door slammed shut behind us with a force so sudden and intense that it felt as though the walls themselves were trying to trap us. Trevor spun around, his breath ragged, his chest heaving as he slammed his palms against the door, trying to pry it open. "Michael, get it open." His voice was a frantic mix of fear and desperation, but no matter how hard he pushed, the door didn't budge. I stood frozen, my mind racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. It was impossible, right? There was no way we'd just found ourselves locked inside a room, with something or someone on the other side waiting. I turned toward the window, hoping for a way out, but it was as if the building was determined to keep us there. The glass was shattered, the edges jagged like broken teeth, but the opening was too high up for either of us to reach. "God," Trevor gasped. "What's happening? Why won't it open?" I didn't have an answer. I felt it too, the oppressive pressure of the room closing in around us. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our breathing and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. Suddenly, the photograph on the table caught my eye again. It was the same one we had seen before, but something was different. The figure sitting in the chair was clearer now, its body more defined, its features sharper. The eyes, they were wide open, staring directly at me. I froze, my heart racing, unable to look away. It wasn't just a photograph. It was a warning, a signal. It was as though the person in the image knew I was here, knew I had been drawn into this nightmare. I stepped closer to the table, my hand trembling as I reached for the photograph. My fingers brushed against the edge of the frame, and then without warning, the lights went out. Pitch blackness swallowed the room in an instant. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, but it barely illuminated the space in front of me. Trevor was beside me now, his hand gripping my arm tightly, his body trembling. "Michael," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. I can't do this anymore. We need to get out of here now." I wanted to agree. I wanted to run. But something inside me told me that we couldn't leave yet, not without understanding what was happening. And then I heard it, the sound of something moving, scraping against the floor, faint but unmistakable. It was coming from the other side of the room. A slow, deliberate dragging, like someone or something was crawling toward us. I turned, the flashlight beam sweeping across the room, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the air thick, heavy, suffocating. And then, as the beam shifted toward the far corner, I saw it. A figure, hunched and disjointed, emerged from the shadows. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't entirely inhuman either. It crawled toward us, its limbs unnaturally long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bone. Its face, a twisted, contorted mask of malice, was fixed in an eerie, wide-eyed stare. My body went cold, the fear gripping me so tightly that I could barely move. I stumbled backward, my hand grasping for Trevor, but he was already gone, running for the door. He was shouting, his voice rising in panic, but the sound was drowned out by the low, guttural growl coming from the creature in front of us. I felt my heart stop. There was no escape, no way out. The creature's eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, I couldn't look away. It was as though time had slowed down. My pulse thundered in my ears, each beat of my heart vibrating through my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was watch as it crawled closer, its grotesque movements dragging it forward, inch by inch. Suddenly, the room seemed to distort, warping around me as if the very walls were bending. The shadows grew longer, and the air grew heavier, as if the building itself were alive and hungry. I couldn't tell where the creature ended and the darkness began. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred, and I was left trapped in a world that didn't make sense, a world where terror had no bounds. Trevor's voice broke through the haze of panic. "Michael," he screamed, his voice barely recognizable through the terror. "The door, it won't." But I couldn't listen. I couldn't focus on anything but the creature's slow approach, its hands pale and gnarled scraping along the floor, the nails tapping against the concrete like a countdown to something worse. And then it spoke. Its voice was low, a raspy hiss that seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing in my mind, vibrating my bones. "Leave," it whispered, the word drawn out like a command, like a warning. The word sent a shock through me, jolting me back to reality, and I realized then this wasn't just some twisted figure. It was something else, something older and darker, something that had been waiting for us, following us, all along. It wasn't just a random encounter, it was deliberate. It was part of the building's story, part of the curse that had been set in motion long before we arrived. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet, my pulse racing. The creature didn't move, but its eyes never left me. The air around it crackled, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath my feet seemed to shift. It was as though the building itself was alive, breathing, closing in on us. "Michael, we need to go." Trevor's voice shattered the silence, and I snapped back into motion, grabbing his arm and yanking him toward the door. But it was too late. The door, the one that had been locked just moments before, was now wide open. Beyond it, the dark hallway stretched out like an endless void, and we could hear something moving in the distance. Something large, something powerful, something that had been waiting for us. I shoved Trevor forward, pushing him out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The creature was still watching us, its eyes fixed on mine, but it didn't follow. It didn't need to. It was already inside us, lodged in our minds, in our souls. As we ran down the hallway, the building seemed to come alive around us. The walls closed in, the air grew thick with dread, and I could hear the sound of something following us, echoing behind us, always just out of sight. It wasn't over. We hadn't escaped. We were still trapped in the factory's web, caught in the grip of something far darker than we had ever imagined. We ran. We ran like our lives depended on it, because they did. Every step was a fight against the suffocating terror that pressed in on us from all sides. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, like it was taunting us, pulling us deeper into the heart of the building that was slowly becoming our tomb. The weight of the air around us grew heavier, the shadows seeming to shift and writhe as though alive, following our every move. Trevor's breath came in ragged gasps, and I could hear his footsteps faltering behind me. But there was no time to stop, no time to wait. We had to get out. We had to escape. The noise behind us, the scraping, dragging sound, was getting closer. Each time I glanced back, I thought I saw the thing the entity just out of sight, its twisted form barely visible in the dark corners of the hallway. But when I turned back to focus on moving forward, it felt as if the space around us was shrinking, like the walls themselves were shifting inward, trying to close off our only escape. We reached the staircase, and I pulled Trevor toward it, my hands trembling with the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The stairwell was dark, too dark, but it was our only way up, our only way to escape. My mind raced. What if there was something worse up there? What if there was nowhere to go? But there was no choice. The thing, whatever it was closing in. We had to climb. I reached the first step, then the second, the sound of my boots clanging against the metal railing echoing through the silence of the building. Trevor followed, slower now, his hands on the railing for support. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his eyes wide with panic, and I couldn't blame him. Every part of me screamed to look back, to check if it was still behind us. But I knew I couldn't. I couldn't afford to make that mistake. It could be right there, just out of sight, waiting for the moment we turned around. The higher we climbed, the more the building felt wrong. The stairs creaked underfoot, the metal groaning, as if it were protest our presence. The air smelled stale, heavy, like something long dead had been sealed away in this place for decades. I tried to shake the thought out of my head, but it lingered, growing more persistent with every step. This wasn't just an abandoned building. It was a tomb, and we were trapped inside it. "Trevor," I said, my voice low but urgent, "we need to keep going. Don't stop, no matter what." Trevor didn't answer. I glanced over at him, but his eyes were wide, unfocused. He was staring at something in the distance, a look of sheer terror on his face. "Trevor, what is it?" I asked, my voice rising in panic. He didn't reply, his gaze still fixed on something ahead of us. I followed his line of sight, my heart leaping into my throat. The top of the stairwell was dark, the light from our flashlights barely illuminating anything beyond the first few steps. But I saw a thing, a shape standing in the shadows at the top of the stairs. A figure, tall and thin, just like the one we had seen in the photographs. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it. But as we drew closer, The figure remained, unmoving, staring down at us from the darkness. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it wasn't just another illusion. This was real. Michael. Trevor's voice was barely a whisper, but I could hear the desperation in it. What do we do? What the hell is that? I didn't know. I didn't have an answer. All I could do was keep climbing, keep moving forward, hoping that whatever it was, whatever presence had taken over this building, wouldn't stop us before we reached the top. As we neared the top of the stairs, the figure seemed to vanish into the shadows, like it was swallowed up by the building itself. I felt my heart sink, a cold knot forming in my stomach. Was it waiting for us up there? Was it luring us into a trap? I couldn't think about that now. We were too close. I pushed forward, my legs burning, my body screaming for rest, but I couldn't stop. We couldn't stop. When we finally reached the top, the door ahead of us was ajar. It was just a sliver, but it was enough for us to see the faint light filtering through. This was it. This was the exit. Trevor reached for the door, his hand trembling as he pushed it open, the sound of the hinges squeaking like a warning. We stepped through, and for a brief moment, I thought we were safe. The cool night air hit us like a shock, and I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the fear lift from my shoulders. But as we stood there, just outside the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. We turned around, and the door we had just come through slammed shut behind us. No sound, no movement. The building stood silent, as though nothing had happened. The shadows had returned to their familiar place, and the dark windows seemed to watch us as we stood there, unsure of what to do next. Trevor's breathing slowed, and I could see the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, but I couldn't let go of the unease gnawing at me. We had escaped, yes, but the building wasn't just a place, it was a living, breathing thing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was far from finished with us. We need to go, I said quietly, my voice hoarse from the panic that had gripped me moments before. We need to leave. Now. Trevor nodded, his face pale, his body shaking with the adrenaline still coursing through him. We didn't look back as we walked away from the building, each step taking us farther from the nightmare we had just lived through. The drive back was silent. Neither of us spoke as we passed the familiar roads, the streets that had once seemed so normal, so safe. The closer we got to the edge of the town, the more the world seemed to return to its usual state. The terror that had gripped us in the abandoned building seemed to fade with each passing mile, replaced by the quiet relief that we had made it out alive. But even as we reached the safety of home, I knew that something had changed. The images of that building, of the figure that had watched us from the darkness, remained etched in my mind. The photographs, the locked doors, the whispers in the dark. It was all too much, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was still out there, waiting, its secrets yet to be revealed. We had escaped, but the questions remained. What had really happened in that place? And why had it chosen us? But those were questions for another day. For now, we had survived. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. The town seemed quiet when we returned, almost unnervingly so. The roads that had been so familiar, the streets lined with homes and shops, looked different now. It was as if the world had shifted just slightly out of alignment. Trevor and I had survived the night, but the experience was not something that could be left behind so easily. The darkness we had encountered in that forsaken building was not just confined to its walls. It had followed us, lingered in the corners of our minds, and crept into the crevices of our daily lives. As the days went on, I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, checking the corners of rooms, listening for the faintest of sounds that might signify something lurking just beyond the reach of the light. Trevor was no different. He had returned to his daily routine, but he was distant, quieter than he had ever been. The weight of that night hung over both of us, unspoken but ever present. I spent hours trying to rationalize what had happened, trying to piece together the events of that night in some logical way. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt like trying to hold water in my hands. The answers slipped away, eluding me, no matter how hard I grasped. There was no explanation for what we had seen, no way to understand the horrors we had encountered. And maybe that was the point. Maybe some things were never meant to be understood. Some places were never meant to be entered. That building, it wasn't just abandoned. It was as if it had been waiting for us, like we were drawn into it by some unseen force, led there by a fate we couldn't comprehend. The figure at the top of the stairs, the strange occurrences in the photographs, the haunting feeling that the building had a life of its own, these were not random events. They were pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find the edge of it, couldn't make it make sense. It was as if that place had been a crossroads, a moment in time where the lines between the living and the dead, between reality and the unknown, blurred into something unrecognizable. When I look back now, I realize that the fear we felt wasn't just about the building. It wasn't about the darkness or the figure we saw or the way the air seemed to change when we stepped inside. The real terror was that we were never meant to leave. The fear wasn't just of what could happen, but of what had already happened. In those moments when we were trapped inside, we weren't just fighting for our lives. We were fighting for our very sense of reality. We were fighting for our understanding of the world, for the belief that everything had a reason, a cause, a rational explanation. But what if there was no explanation? What if the world we lived in wasn't as neatly defined as we thought? What if there were places, hidden places, forgotten places where the rules didn't apply? That's what the building represented. A crack in the facade of reality, a tear in the fabric of the world that we knew. And we had been foolish enough to step through it, thinking that we could control what we found on the other side. In the aftermath, we tried to go back to normal. We tried to erase the memories of that night, to move on with our lives as if nothing had changed. But the truth is, nothing was the same. The building was still out there, standing in silence, waiting for the next soul to stumble across its threshold. And no matter how far we ran, no matter how much time passed, we knew that we could never truly escape it. The photographs we had taken, the ones that had initially seemed like simple snapshots of an old, abandoned place, became something more. They became a record of our encounter with something beyond our comprehension. Every time I looked at those photos, I saw something new, something that had been hidden in plain sight. A shadow in the corner of a frame, a flicker of movement in the background, a detail that shouldn't have been there. Were these just tricks of the light? Or were they remnants of the entity that had haunted us, imprints of its presence, frozen in time? I couldn't say for certain. I couldn't even say if the building itself had been real. Or maybe it had been real, but not in the way we understood reality. Perhaps it was a place that existed in the space between the worlds, a place where time and space bent and twisted, where the laws of nature and logic didn't apply. And if that was the case, then perhaps what we experienced, there was only a fragment of a much larger, much darker truth. There was a part of me that wanted to return, to go back and explore further, to understand what we had barely glimpsed. But that part of me was small, buried deep beneath the weight of the fear and the knowledge that some things were not meant to be uncovered. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed again. And I knew, deep down, that if we ever returned to that place, we might not be lucky enough to make it out alive next time. Trevor and I remained friends, but something had changed between us. The bond we shared before was still there, but it was now tempered with a shared understanding of what we had witnessed, an unspoken agreement that some things were better left unexplored. We no longer talked about the building. We no longer spoke of the entity that had stalked us in the darkness. But we both knew that the experience had left an indelible mark on us, a scar that would never heal. Years later, when I drive past that old part of town, I sometimes catch a glimpse of the abandoned building in the distance. It stands there, as it always has, a silent sentinel in the darkness. I wonder if anyone else will ever be drawn to it, as we were. if anyone else will feel that inexplicable pull to enter. I wonder if they'll be able to leave when they do, or if they'll, like us, find themselves caught in the web of something far older and more dangerous than they could ever understand. The truth is, I'll never know, and maybe that's for the best. Some things are better left in the dark, forgotten, and never spoken of again. Because once you've seen what's behind that door, there's no one seeing it. And so, I live with the knowledge that I have encountered something beyond the known world, something that will haunt me for the rest of my life. But at least I'm still here to carry that knowledge. At least I'm still here to tell the story. And perhaps that's the most terrifying thing of all. It was just another weekend trip. My friends and I were looking to get away from the noise of the city, seeking some peace and quiet in nature, away from the distractions of everyday life. We were a group of 4, close-knit from years of friendship, and had taken these kinds of trips before. Hiking, camping, and the occasional campfire story. Those were the activities we looked forward to the most. We'd been to this particular forest once before, though it had been a couple of years since our last visit. The air was always thick with the smell of pine and damp earth, and the trails were often quiet, an ideal place for us to disconnect. We drove out early that Saturday morning, eager to leave behind the hum of technology and the stress of our jobs. There was myself, and then there was Ben, who was always the one with the most enthusiasm for any adventure. He was the type of guy who couldn't sit still for too long, and he'd usually start talking about the next move the second we finished setting up camp. Then there was Tom, quiet, contemplative, the kind of person who would sit by the fire and just listen to the crackling of the logs, occasionally chiming in with a witty remark. And finally, there was Jake, the planner, who always came prepared for anything, even though we rarely needed half of the things he packed. Together, we made a pretty solid group. Our plan was simple. Take a trail we'd never explored before, find a spot along the river to set up camp, and spend the evening around the fire. Tom had brought his guitar, I had packed the food, Ben was already carrying a few logs for the fire, and Jake, of course, had every piece of gear you could possibly imagine. We were well equipped and excited for the day ahead. The hike started out normal enough, with the usual chatter as we walked along the well-trodden path. The sun was high in the sky, casting dappled light through the canopy, and the air was still warm, even with a slight breeze. We had made our way deeper into the woods, away from the more popular areas, when we found a fork in the trail. A small sign was nailed to a tree, warning of a shortcut through the woods that would lead to the river. Ben, as usual, was the first to suggest taking it. "Hey, it'll save us time, guys." "Let's do it," he said, looking over at us with that usual grin. At first, none of us hesitated. Why not? It was a shortcut. We had the time to spare, and the weather was perfect for a day out in the wild. Tom shrugged, muttered something about taking the scenic route anyway, and walked forward. Jake, who was always a bit cautious, hesitated for a moment, but then followed, muttering under his breath about how shortcuts always seem to have their downsides. But we were used to Jake's overthinking, so we just laughed it off and continued on the new trail. The path was less defined than the main one, the earth soft and squishy beneath our boots. Branches hung low, and the air seemed heavier, but we shrugged it off. The woods around us looked almost the same as before, majestic, serene, but there was something subtly different about the atmosphere. It wasn't a drastic change, but there was a slight heaviness to the air, a quietness that settled over us as we ventured further into the trees. We had been walking for about an hour when I first started to feel a strange sense that we weren't as alone as we thought. It wasn't the sound of animals or rustling leaves, it was something else entirely. The woods, despite their beauty, felt more oppressive. I chalked it up to nerves. Maybe I was just letting my mind get carried away, especially with all the stories we'd heard about forests, like these stories of people getting lost, of hikers who vanished without a trace. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. "So, how much farther do you think this shortcut is?" Tom asked, looking back at us. His voice seemed unusually loud in the eerie silence that had descended. Jake, who had been checking the map, glanced up with a furrowed brow. "We're still on the right path. Should be just up ahead." I could see Ben's face light up at the mention of getting there soon. He was always the first to rush ahead, to explore new things. But this time, there was something different about his excitement. It almost seemed forced, like he was trying to convince himself that everything was fine. We pressed on, the quiet tension growing thicker with each step. As the forest closed in around us, the path grew narrower, and the sounds of the outside world, cars, people, the usual hum of civilization disappeared completely. We were deep in the woods now, far from any recognizable landmarks. A part of me began to feel uneasy, but I ignored it. It was just a trail after all. But then, something caught my eye. A faint flicker of movement in the distance, a figure, maybe just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal or another hiker, but then the figure disappeared before I could get a good look. "Did you see that?" I asked quietly, glancing at Ben, who had been walking ahead. He paused for a moment and looked back at me. "What?" "That movement. Back there, in the trees," I said, pointing toward the spot where I'd seen the figure. Ben furrowed his brow, his face unreadable. "I didn't see anything. Must have been a bird or something." I wasn't so sure. The air felt thick again, and for some reason, it felt like we were being watched. "Let's just keep going," Jake said, his voice a little more tense than usual. "We're almost there, right?" There was a slight quiver in his voice, but none of us said anything more. I didn't want to admit that I felt the same unease, and I knew Ben didn't want to hear it. We moved forward in silence, the only sound being our footsteps crunching through the undergrowth. The woods were starting to feel different now, darker, colder. Something was changing, but we couldn't quite put our finger on it. As the trees crowded in around us, it became harder to see the sky. The air felt heavy, damp even, though it hadn't rained. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint sounds from behind us, like footsteps, but when I turned around, no one was there. Then we came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. In the center of the clearing stood an abandoned campsite. A fire pit sat in the middle, cold and lifeless. Some burnt-out logs lay scattered nearby, and a few items, a sleeping bag, a torn tarp, were abandoned, half buried in the dirt. It was unsettling, but what struck me the most was how recently it looked. The campfire wasn't completely cold. There were still some embers glowing faintly, as if someone had just left moments ago. We stood there for a moment, staring at the campsite, the air thick with uncertainty. None of us said anything, but I could feel the unease spreading among us. Ben was the first to break the silence. "All right, let's get a fire going. We can camp here for the night." But as we began to set up, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that the forest was watching us. And that's when the real unease began. We started unloading our gear, the usual routine of setting up camp unfolding as we worked together. Ben immediately took charge of gathering firewood, his usual excitement carrying him around the campsite like a whirlwind. Tom set his guitar down on the ground, kicking back against a tree as usual, while Jake began pulling out his camping stove and cookware. I focused on setting up the tent, trying to ignore the unease creeping up my spine. The campsite was eerily quiet, the silence only interrupted by the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the soft rustling of the leaves above. I kept glancing around, as if waiting for something to break the stillness. But there was nothing. The woods felt alive in their own way, but not in a comforting sense. It felt as if everything was holding its breath. While I was securing the tent pegs, I glanced back toward the fire pit. The embers were still faintly glowing, but I noticed something odd. A small pile of fresh-looking wood had been stacked neatly next to the pit. It was too perfect, almost deliberate. "Hey, Ben, did you put that wood there?" I called over, my voice carrying the slight tension I felt. Ben looked up from his task, a log in each hand. He followed my gaze to the pile of wood near the fire pit, and his face twisted in confusion. "No, I didn't. I thought you did." I frowned. No one had been near the fire pit yet, not since we'd arrived. The wood didn't look like it had been there long, but it also wasn't scattered or left in disarray like a typical abandoned campsite. The neatness stood out. Tom, who had been lounging under a tree, raised an eyebrow. Maybe some other campers left it behind. You know, it's common to leave extra firewood for people passing through, but I wasn't convinced. It didn't seem right. There was something off about it, something that made my stomach churn slightly. The way it had been stacked so perfectly. It just didn't sit well with me. I shook off the feeling. Maybe I was just overthinking things. After all, it wasn't exactly unusual for someone to leave firewood behind in a campsite. Still, I couldn't shake the thought that something wasn't quite right about the situation. We continued with our preparations, and the unease settled into the background, just a faint hum that I couldn't fully ignore. Ben and Tom started a fire with the wood we gathered, while Jake began boiling water for our dinner. The flickering flames cast long shadows that danced across the trees, adding to the odd sense of disquiet I was feeling. Everything was going according to plan until we started eating. The fire crackled and popped, sending occasional sparks into the air. The smell of the food, sizzling in the pot, mixed with the earthy scent of the forest, but there was something else. A distant, almost imperceptible sound, like something moving through the underbrush. I tried to brush it off as an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but it kept coming back, persistent and too regular to be just wildlife. I paused mid-bite, straining my ears to listen. It was faint but steady. It didn't sound like the usual sounds of a forest at night, no chirping insects or rustling leaves. It was more like footsteps. I looked over at Ben, but he seemed to be too absorbed in his food to notice. "Did you guys hear that?" I asked, lowering my fork. Tom glanced up, frowning. "What?" "Something out there," I said, motioning toward the trees beyond the campfire's glow. "It sounds like footsteps." Jake, who had been quieter than usual, finally spoke up. "It could be someone else. I mean, we're not exactly in the middle of nowhere. People might pass through here." I wasn't so sure. The sound was too deliberate, too constant, as though whatever was moving out there was pacing back and forth, circling the campsite. It wasn't the random shuffle of a forest creature looking for food. It sounded human, but no one else was supposed to be here. "I'll go take a look," I said, standing up abruptly, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. "No, wait," Jake said, standing up as well, his hand outstretched. "It's probably nothing. Stay here." But the sound was starting to get under my skin. My legs itched to move, to investigate, and Ben, though a little reluctant, seemed to understand. He stood as well, grabbing the flashlight from his pack. "Let's go check it out," he said, his voice low but firm. "If it's nothing, we'll come back and eat. If it's something, we'll be ready." Tom stayed back by the fire, grumbling something about us being paranoid, but we didn't pay him any mind. Ben and I took off toward the edge of the clearing, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the trees. The woods seemed unnaturally still, like they were waiting too. As we neared the tree line, I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. The air was still, yet something felt off. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the forest was trying to push back against us. And then, just as I was about to call out to Ben, the sound stopped. We froze. There was absolute silence now. I scanned the trees, the flashlight beam bouncing off the trunks of the thick pines, but there was no sign of movement. No rustling, no sounds of footsteps. Just the occasional rustle of wind through the branches high above us. "What the hell?" Ben muttered, clearly unnerved. "Where did it go?" I swallowed hard, my stomach twisting. "I don't know." We stood there for a long moment, the silence hanging heavily in the air. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was almost as if the forest was holding its breath, too. Just as I was about to turn around and head back to the camp, the sound came again. But this time, it was different. It was closer, louder, more deliberate. And it was coming from directly behind us. Ben's flashlight swung around in the direction of the noise, but we saw nothing. No person, no animal. Just the endless expanse of trees stretching in all directions. "What the hell is that?" Ben whispered, his voice barely audible. I was about to suggest we get back to the camp when we both heard something else. A soft rustling from the direction of the fire pit, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching the dry leaves underfoot. But no one had moved from the campsite. We turned around in unison, but by the time we reached the clearing, there was no one there. The fire flickered and crackled, casting long shadows over the campsite. Tom was still sitting by the fire, looking at us with a bored expression. But the unease hadn't left. In fact, it had only deepened. "Maybe it was just the wind," Ben said, his voice trembling slightly as he glanced around the clearing. But I knew it wasn't the wind. There was something out there, something that wasn't right, and the realization hit me like a cold wave. Whatever it wasn't just passing through. It was watching us. We didn't talk much after that. Dinner was silent, and no one dared to suggest another hike or even a walk around the campsite. It felt as if the forest itself was holding us captive, waiting for us to make a wrong move. By the time we settled into our tents for the night, I could still hear that sound in my mind, the footsteps, the rustling, the presence lurking just beyond the firelight. And I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next day, I woke up to the eerie stillness of the forest around us. The morning sun filtered through the dense canopy above, casting long, dappled shadows across the campsite. A light fog clung to the forest floor, weaving between the trees like ghostly fingers reaching out. The air felt thick, damp with moisture, but the usual morning sounds of birdsong and rustling leaves were absent. It was as though the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I got up from my sleeping bag, my eyes still heavy with sleep. Ben, Tom, and Jake were already awake, sitting around the fire pit, each one with a contemplative expression on their face. No one had spoken much after the unsettling events of the previous night. The strange footsteps, the feeling of being watched, no one could shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Morning," I muttered, trying to shake off the lingering unease. Ben didn't look up right away. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Morning," he said quietly, his gaze still fixed on the ground. Tom, as usual, tried to lighten the mood, though his voice lacked its usual upbeat tone. "So, did everyone sleep well? I swear, I'm starting to feel like we're in some kind of horror movie." I let out a nervous chuckle, but there was no real humor in it. It was hard to focus on anything else but the strange happenings, the sounds we couldn't explain, the sense of being stalked by something unseen. We ate breakfast in tense silence, none of us eager to break the stillness. The food seemed tasteless, even though it was the same as always. It was as if the entire experience of camping had been tainted by the inexplicable fear that had settled in our bones. The morning passed slowly, with each minute dragging on, but none of us had the courage to leave the campsite. I kept my eyes on the trees, scanning the edges of the clearing, but the forest felt different. The trees seemed to be closing in on us, their shadows creeping further into the open space. The sunlight that had filtered through the branches earlier now seemed muted, as though it was being swallowed by the darkness that lurked just out of sight. The tension was palpable. By mid-afternoon, we could stand it no longer. The stillness had become unbearable. Ben, ever the leader of the group, finally spoke up. "We need to figure out what's going on. Let's take a walk around the perimeter, check out the surroundings. Maybe there's something we're missing." I didn't like the idea of leaving the campsite, especially with the nagging feeling that something or someone was lurking just outside our vision. But I didn't want to seem paranoid either. I nodded in agreement, though a part of me still hesitated. The four of us set off into the forest, walking single file along the narrow trail that cut through the trees. The path was uneven, with tangled roots and thick underbrush that made every step feel like a chore. As we moved deeper into the woods, the atmosphere seemed to change once again. The air grew colder, the dampness seeping into my clothes, and the faint smell of earth and decay hung in the air. The trees around us seemed to close in, their gnarled branches twisting into strange shapes, as though they were reaching out to grab us. I glanced back at the campsite, barely visible through the thick foliage, but it seemed far away now, almost unreachable. As we continued walking, I felt a sudden, sharp chill in the air. It wasn't just the temperature, it felt like a presence, something cold and unfathomable that brushed against my skin. I turned to look at Ben, but he was ahead of me, his expression grim. Tom and Jake were a few steps behind, their movements slow and cautious. "Do you feel that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Ben nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, something's not right here." We walked for what felt like hours, but we didn't reach the end of the trail. Instead, we seemed to be moving in circles, the trees around us growing denser and darker with every step. The faint sound of rustling leaves echoed in the distance, but it wasn't the soft whisper of the wind anymore. It was more deliberate, more purposeful. And then we saw it. A figure standing just off the trail, half hidden behind a tree. It was a person, at least. I thought it was a person. The figure was too still, too silent, as if they were waiting for something. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who's there?" Ben called out, his voice shaking with a mix of fear and authority. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it seemed to tilt its head, as if studying us. I could feel my throat tighten, the fear spreading like a virus through my body. My legs felt heavy, as if I was rooted to the spot. The figure remained motionless, its features obscured by the shadows of the trees, but there was something unnatural about it. Something that made every instinct in my body scream at me to run. Tom, ever the skeptic, stepped forward. "It's probably just some other hiker. Maybe they got lost." But I didn't buy it. The way the figure stood there, motionless and silent, was wrong. It wasn't acting like someone who had gotten lost. It was waiting for us. "Let's go," I whispered urgently, my voice barely audible. But before we could turn and flee, the figure moved. It didn't walk, it shifted, sliding into the shadows as if it was part of the darkness itself. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone. We stood there, frozen, for a long moment. No one spoke. The air felt thick and oppressive, pressing down on us like a heavy weight. "Let's get back to camp," Ben finally said, his voice low and tight with fear. We turned around, moving quickly now, our footsteps loud and uneven on the trail. The forest seemed to grow darker with every step we took, the trees leaning in on us, the shadows creeping closer. As we reached the edge of the clearing, I looked back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following us. But there was nothing, just the dense forest stretching endlessly into the distance. We didn't talk much as we made our way back to the camp. The weight of what we had seen hung heavily in the air, and the tension was unbearable. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure once again, but each time I found nothing but the trees and the deepening shadows. When we finally returned to the camp, it felt like a small victory. The fire was still burning, though it had dwindled to a faint glow. We set our packs down in silence, and for a long time, none of us spoke. The night settled in quickly, and with it came the oppressive silence of the woods. The fire crackled, sending occasional sparks into the air, but there was no comfort in its warmth. It felt more like a barrier, a small, fragile line between us and whatever was waiting just beyond the trees. And as the darkness deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The footsteps, the figure, the sensation of something lurking just beyond the edge of the campfire's light, all of it combined into an overwhelming sense of dread. I tried to focus on the fire, but my mind kept drifting back to the figure we had seen. The way it moved, the way it stood there, watching us, waiting for something. We had no answers, only questions. And the more we tried to ignore them, the more they crept into our minds, poisoning every thought, every movement. Whatever was out there in the woods was not done with us yet. The fire crackled and sputtered as the last of the night's tension lingered in the air. The figure, whatever it was, had disappeared into the woods, but the damage had already been done. Our hearts pounded in our chests, and the silence that followed felt almost as oppressive as the events that had just unfolded. We were left standing there, in the darkened clearing, uncertain of what we had just experienced. Was it real? Was it some sort of twisted hallucination brought on by exhaustion? Or was there something much darker at work here? Something that had followed us from the moment we set foot in this cursed part of the woods. Ben was the first to speak, though his voice was hoarse and shaky. "We need to get out of here. Now." His words cut through the tension like a knife, and I could see the fear in his eyes. We all felt it, that primal fear that made it impossible to stand still any longer. We had come here looking for adventure, but what we had found instead was something far worse, a nightmare that had bled into reality. Tom and Jake didn't argue. They looked at each other, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear, but they didn't need to say anything. We all knew it was time to leave. The woods, with their darkened corners and hidden terrors, had become a place we no longer wanted to be. We hurriedly gathered our things, throwing our backpacks and camping gear together in a haphazard rush. There was no time for careful packing, no time to assess what we had left behind. All that mattered was getting out of the woods before whatever had been lurking there came back for us. I glanced over my shoulder one last time, half expecting to see the figure standing in the shadows, watching us. But there was nothing, just the dark expanse of trees and the cold, unyielding silence. Yet even as I turned my back on the woods, I could feel that gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach, that feeling that we weren't alone. Ben led the way, his pace brisk and urgent. We followed in silence, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet the only sound as we made our way through the trees. The forest, which had once felt like a place of adventure and excitement, now felt like a trap. The shadows stretched longer than they should have, and the wind whispered through the branches in eerie patterns, like an invisible hand brushing against our skin. As we moved deeper into the woods, I could feel the weight of the night pressing in on me. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. The forest had changed in those few hours. It was no longer just a place of trees and wildlife. It was something darker, something more dangerous, and I could sense it watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Ben turned to me as we walked. His face was grim, and his eyes were hard, but there was something else in them too, a look of confusion, as if he didn't fully understand what had happened. "Do you think it was real?" he asked, his voice low. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to tell him that it was just our minds playing tricks on us, that we had all been stressed, tired, and that the shadows of the forest had warped our perceptions. But I couldn't lie. I couldn't pretend that what we had seen wasn't real. The terror in Ben's eyes, the coldness that had gripped my body, the way the figure had moved it, all pointed to one undeniable truth. "It was real," I said quietly. "I don't know what it was, but it was real." Ben didn't answer, and the weight of his silence hung heavy in the air. We kept walking, pushing through the thick underbrush, trying to distance ourselves from the nightmare that had unfolded just hours before. But no matter how fast we moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. Something that was waiting for us to slip up, to falter. The darkness had a way of creeping up on you, of making you feel like you were never truly safe. As the hours passed, we made our way back to the trailhead, the path that would lead us out of the woods. The trees began to thin, the oppressive darkness lifting slightly as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. But even as the sun started to rise, the dread that had settled in my chest didn't go away. It was like a shadow that had taken root in my soul, one that I couldn't shake, no matter how much light surrounded me. By the time we reached the edge of the forest, we were all exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. We stumbled out into the open field where we had parked our car, the sight of it a small comfort in the midst of the chaos. The world felt different now. The world outside the woods seemed normal, calm even, but there was something fundamentally altered in the way we viewed it. We had seen something that night, something that had left its mark on us, and no amount of sunlight could erase that. We loaded ourselves into the car, and I could feel the tension still hanging between us, a quiet, unspoken fear. The drive back was long, and none of us spoke much. We were too tired, too lost in our own thoughts, but there was also an unspoken understanding between us. Whatever we had faced in those woods, we weren't ready to talk about it. Not yet. The drive home was uneventful, but it wasn't comforting. It was like we were all still waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the night to come back to haunt us. No matter how far we went, I felt like it was always there, just beyond the horizon, watching us. When I finally got home, I went straight to my room. I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure, whatever it was still out there, still waiting. I tried to sleep, tried to forget, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, the cold, lifeless eyes, the silhouette standing just beyond the firelight, its presence an anchor in the darkness. Days passed, but the unease lingered. The others and I spoke occasionally, but our conversations were short, hollow. We couldn't forget what had happened, and I don't think any of us really wanted to. There were too many questions, too many things left unsaid. What was that figure? Why had it been there? What did it want from us? The questions ate at me, gnawing at my mind, but no answers ever came. The woods had given us nothing but fear, and in return, we had left with more than we bargained for. I kept trying to tell myself that it was over, that whatever had happened, whatever we had seen, was behind us. But there was a part of me deep down, hidden beneath the layers of logic and reason that knew better. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out of those woods. Something that would never leave us, no matter how far we ran. I think about the woods every time I hear the wind rustle the leaves outside my window, every time I hear a footstep in the distance, every time I'm alone in the dark. And every time I wonder if it's still watching, if it's still waiting. The weeks following our harrowing experience in the woods passed in a blur. The once familiar routine of daily life seemed distant, like a memory from another time. I tried to move on, tried to convince myself that what we had encountered was nothing more than a trick of the mind, a shared nightmare that we would eventually laugh off. But no matter how hard I tried, there was always that lingering sense of unease, that knowing feeling that something had changed within me, something I couldn't quite place. I kept thinking about the woods, about the figure that had appeared at the edge of the campsite. Its face, cold and emotionless, haunted my thoughts. Even in the light of day, when the world felt safe and normal, I couldn't escape the feeling that I had left something behind in those woods, something that was waiting, still watching, somewhere just beyond the edge of my vision. It was as if the woods had touched something deep inside me, something primal and dark that I couldn't fully understand. I tried to contact the others, to check in on them, to see if they were feeling the same way. But when I did, the conversations were always brief, each of us dancing around the real topic, avoiding what had happened like an unspoken taboo. We all knew something had changed in us, but none of us were ready to confront it head on. Maybe we were scared, maybe we were ashamed, or maybe we just didn't have the words to express the terror that still gripped our minds. Ben was the first to reach out to me again, a few days after I had sent him a message. He seemed different, quieter, more distant, and his tone was cautious, as if he were walking on eggshells. "I keep hearing things at night," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I was just being paranoid, but it's like, something's there. I can't shake the feeling. I could relate. I hadn't told anyone, but I too had begun hearing strange noises in the quiet of the night, scratching at my windows, footsteps in the hallway when I knew I was alone. I had tried to tell myself it was nothing, just the house settling, the wind, or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew better. We talked for a while. exchanging our fears, each of us coming to the same conclusion. Whatever had happened that night in the woods hadn't ended when we left. Whatever we had encountered, whatever we had seen, it was still with us. It wasn't something we could simply walk away from, no matter how far we ran. In the days that followed, the unease grew stronger. It wasn't just at night anymore. It was during the day too, when I was walking to work, or sitting at a cafe, or driving down the highway. The sense of being watched, of being followed, never left me. I began to notice small things, the way people in crowds seemed to glance at me a little too long, the way the shadows seemed to linger at the edge of my vision, always, just out of reach. I started avoiding the woods altogether, telling myself that I had no reason to go back, no reason to put myself in that same situation. But that didn't stop the nightmares. Every night, without fail, I would dream of the woods, of the figure, its face obscured by shadow, standing just beyond the firelight, waiting. Sometimes it would approach me, its cold, lifeless eyes never leaving mine. Other times, I would be running through the trees, the sound of footsteps behind me growing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I couldn't explain why it was happening. I didn't know if it was the lingering effects of the terror we had faced, or if there was something more sinister at work. But I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to face it. One evening, about a month after we had left the woods, I drove out to the edge of the forest. I parked my car at the entrance, the same entrance where we had entered all those weeks ago. The air was thick with tension, the sky dimming with the approach of dusk. I had no real reason for being there, no specific plan or goal. I just knew I had to see it for myself, to confront the place that had changed everything. I walked into the woods alone, the sound of my footsteps crunching against the dry leaves and twigs beneath me. The familiar scent of pine and earth filled my nostrils, but it was different this time. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. I walked deeper into the woods, my heart pounding in my chest. Each step seemed to take me further away from the safety of the world I knew, further into the unknown. The trees loomed over me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands, casting long shadows on the ground. It felt like I was being drawn in, pulled towards something I couldn't escape. And then I saw at the clearing where we had set up camp. It looked unchanged, almost eerily so. The remains of the fire pit were still there, the stones scattered around it, charred wood and ash still clinging to the ground. The tent poles, twisted and bent from our hasty departure, lay where we had left them. But it was the silence that struck me the most. It wasn't the peaceful silence of nature, but something far darker, an empty, suffocating silence, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do next. My thoughts raced, my breath coming in shallow gasps, as the memories of that night flooded back. The figure, the fear, the feeling of being watched, it was all so real, so vivid. But as I stood there, I realized something. The fear wasn't coming from the woods, it was coming from me. From the part of me that couldn't let go of what had happened. The part of me that kept searching for answers, even when there were none to find. As the last light of day disappeared behind the horizon, I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. Some stories, some experiences, don't have clear resolutions. They don't offer neat conclusions or easy answers. The woods had given me nothing but fear, and perhaps that was all it would ever give me. Maybe some things are meant to stay unanswered, left to fester in the shadows where they belong. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever had happened in those woods, whatever we had faced, would stay with me. It would stay with all of us. Because sometimes the things we encounter aren't just stories, they become a part of us. And no matter how far we run, no matter how much time passes, those things will always be there, lurking in the corners of our minds, waiting for the right moment to remind us that they never truly leave. And so I moved forward, not because I had forgotten, but because I had learned to live with it. The fear, the unease, the darkness, it was now a part of me, a shadow that would always follow, no matter where I went. And as I walked away from the woods, I realized that maybe that was the scariest part of all. That some things can never be escaped. It was one of those typical weekends, the kind that you don't think too much about when it's happening. But years later, you find yourself replaying it in your mind, wondering how it all started, where things went wrong. It all began with a simple road trip, a break from the daily grind. I was just a guy in his late 30s, trying to escape the monotony of city life. Work had been stressful lately, and I was craving some peace, some time to reconnect with nature. So I decided to head out to the mountains. I'd rented a small cabin through a service online. Nothing fancy, just a cozy spot to get away for a few days. I didn't have a lot of experience with long drives like this one. Sure, I'd gone on the occasional weekend getaway before, but this was different. The cabin was a good 6 hours away, tucked somewhere deep in the heart of the mountains, far from civilization. I was going solo. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I looked forward to it. My only company was a playlist full of relaxing tunes and a bag of snacks for the ride. It was a Friday morning when I picked up the rental car. I had booked it online the day before, choosing a nondescript sedan, something comfortable for a long journey. I walked into the rental office, greeted by a friendly clerk who quickly got me set up. He handed me the keys and a map, pointing to the area where I'd be driving. "It's a beautiful route," he said with a grin. "The mountains up there are incredible this time of year." I thanked him, took the keys, and made my way to the car. I was already looking forward to the open road, the sense of freedom that comes with a long drive. I plugged in my phone to the car's Bluetooth system, set up my playlist, and started the engine. The first few hours were uneventful. The highway stretched out ahead of me, the rolling hills of the countryside turning into more rugged terrain as I got closer to the mountains. I found myself slipping into a comfortable rhythm, the hum of the engine and the occasional glance at the map in my hand. The map wasn't anything special, just a basic paper map with dotted lines showing the main route. But then, something caught my eye. As I was glancing at the map, I noticed something strange. The route I had planned to take, the one the clerk had shown me earlier, didn't quite match the one on the paper. It wasn't a huge difference, just a subtle shift in the path. At first, I thought I might have been reading it wrong, so I took a second look. The more I looked, the more I realized that the path on the map seemed off. There were new roads, unfamiliar markings, roads that didn't exist in the real world. It wasn't a huge deal. After all, it was just a map, right? A piece of paper. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The clerk had seemed so confident about the route, and yet here I was, holding a map that showed something entirely different. Maybe it was just a mistake, a misprint. Still, it bothered me. I brushed it off, deciding to ignore the weirdness for now. I focused on the road ahead, keeping my attention on the winding curves of the highway. The landscape outside the car window was breathtaking, the tall pines, the jagged peaks rising in the distance, the occasional stream running alongside the road. It was beautiful, peaceful, and everything I needed it to be. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, something felt off. The air was getting heavier, the landscape growing more desolate. The road was getting quieter, and I hadn't passed a gas station in hours. I glanced at the map again. The dotted line that should have taken me to my cabin was now leading me down an unfamiliar stretch of road. The map seemed to shift, almost like it was guiding me somewhere I hadn't planned to go. I tried to ignore it. It was probably just a glitch, a misprint, right? But as I kept driving, the unease continued to grow. The path I had been following, what I thought was the right route, was fading. The road signs became fewer, the landmarks more obscure. The mountain range I was heading towards started to look less like something out of a picture-perfect postcard and more like something out of a bad dream. I could almost feel it, a growing sense of something watching, waiting, something that had been quietly, subtly guiding me onto a new path. But I wasn't about to turn back now. The road had already taken me far enough from home. I told myself it was just the isolation of the mountains messing with my mind. After all, how could something as simple as a map make me feel like this? But as I rounded another curve, a strange chill ran down my spine. I was getting close. To what though? I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the map was trying to tell me something I wasn't ready to understand. Something was waiting for me up ahead. I had no choice but to push forward. The road was getting increasingly eerie, winding tighter around the steep mountain slopes, the trees growing denser, their limbs stretching like dark, bony fingers reaching toward the sky. It was getting harder to shake the feeling that I was being led somewhere I shouldn't go. The map, which had once seemed like an innocent tool, now felt like a dark riddle. The unfamiliar route it pointed to wasn't just some minor detour, it was taking me deeper into the wilderness, far beyond the cabin I had rented. A nagging thought had begun to form in my mind. What if this was the wrong route altogether? What if the map was leading me somewhere else? I had only been driving for a few more hours when I started noticing the first signs of something strange. It was just after sunset when I passed the first oddity. The road ahead was lit dimly by the fading light, and as I drove, I saw a figure standing by the roadside. It wasn't unusual to see people walking in the mountains, but this figure was different. He was standing absolutely still, almost as though he was waiting for something. His clothing was outdated, worn in a way that didn't match the usual hikers I'd seen on my way. He wore a long, heavy jacket, even though the weather was mild, and his face was obscured by a large hat. I wasn't sure what to make of it. Maybe he was a local, maybe a hiker, or someone who lived in the area. But there was something about the way he stood there, his rigid posture, his complete lack of movement, that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I approached, my foot hovered over the brake, almost instinctively. But I didn't stop. I kept driving, my eyes fixed ahead, trying not to glance back. I told myself it was nothing. He was just someone out for a walk in the mountains, right? But the unease lingered, like a shadow over my thoughts. The next oddity came not long after. As I passed another bend in the road, the map in my hand started to flicker. At first, I thought I had just imagined it. The paper seemed to ripple as though it had caught the wind, but I hadn't opened the window. When I checked it, the lines seemed to shift just a little at first, but enough to make my pulse quicken. The roads I just passed were marked differently now, their paths blending with unfamiliar routes I didn't recognize. I stopped the car on the side of the road, my hands shaking slightly as I held the map. The flickering didn't make sense. Maps didn't do that. It was as if the road itself had changed on me, like it was reacting to something unseen. I quickly put the map down and turned my attention back to the road, trying to push the thought out of my head. There was no time to waste, night was falling fast, and I still had miles to go before I would even reach the cabin. I pressed on, but it was hard to shake the feeling that something was wrong. As darkness enveloped the road, the headlights of my car cast long shadows against the thick trees. The only sounds now were the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a low, distant sound that I couldn't quite place. It was almost like a tapping, rhythmic and persistent, coming from somewhere behind the car. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing. The road was empty. I checked the side mirrors, then the rear view again, my heart starting to race. The sound hadn't stopped. It was still there, faint but unmistakable. Tapping. I turned the radio on, hoping to drown out the noise. It helped for a moment, but the tapping continued, still soft but persistent. Was it just the road, the car, the wind? I couldn't say for sure, but the fact that I couldn't explain it made it worse. And as I passed another stretch of dense forest, the tapping seemed to get louder, closer, as if someone or something was just out of sight, following me. My foot hit the gas pedal harder than I intended, but I kept driving, eyes glued to the road ahead. This couldn't be happening. It had to be my imagination, right? I mean, who could possibly be following me this far out, this late at night? But the tapping didn't stop. It was only when I reached another bend in the road that I saw something else. A sign, old and rusted, stood at the edge of the road. I hadn't noticed it earlier, but now that I was so close, I couldn't ignore it. The sign was faded, its lettering nearly impossible to make out. It seemed to have been there for years, maybe even decades. The strange thing, though, was that the sign was pointing in the direction I had just come from. A sharp, jagged arrow, as if warning me to turn around. The sign read something that looked like, "Beware," but the rest of the message was too worn away to read. At that moment, I didn't feel like I was just on a road trip anymore. It felt like I had stumbled into something old and forgotten. Something that shouldn't have been left behind, and certainly not something I should be messing with. I couldn't explain why, but the sign made the hairs on my neck stand on end. It felt like a warning, as though it were telling me to leave. But I couldn't turn back now. Not after all this. I was too far in. I pushed the thought out of my mind, deciding to keep going. The map was still in my lap. The strange route it had been showing me now burned into my memory. The tapping noise had stopped, but the unease remained. Every turn, every shadow seemed to make the quiet of the mountain road feel heavier. Like something was waiting, just out of sight. Then I saw it, a flicker of light up ahead. It was dim, barely noticeable, but there was no mistaking it a light. A lantern, maybe? Someone else was out here, or something. I slowed the car, my heart racing as I pulled up closer. But when I got closer, the light disappeared. I blinked, unsure of what I had just seen. For a moment, I wondered if my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no, it was real. The light had been there, and now it was gone. The tension was rising, and my grip on the steering wheel tightened. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, loud and fast. Whatever was going on, whatever path I was being led down, it wasn't normal. I couldn't explain it, but something deep inside me screamed that I needed to turn back. But by now, I was too far gone. I had been driving for what seemed like hours, the road stretching endlessly before me, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The quiet stillness of the mountains wrapped itself around me, as though nature itself was holding its breath. The once clear path I thought I was on had begun to fade into something else, something I couldn't explain. The trees along the roadside grew denser, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes, almost as though they were reaching out toward the car. The sun was now low, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch further with each passing minute. At first, it had been subtle, a slight unease at the strange markings on the map. But now it was becoming harder to ignore. The world outside the car felt different. The road seemed to narrow, the path less defined. The air was thick with something I couldn't quite place. I rolled down the window, hoping the cool breeze would clear my mind. But instead, the air that came in felt damp, heavy, like the weight of 1,000 unspoken things. I glanced at the map again, my eyes skimming over the faint lines that marked my route. The road I had intended to take, the one that should have led me to the cabin, was no longer there. In its place was a jagged line that seemed to twist and turn on itself, looping back in directions I didn't recognize. I pulled over to the side of the road, trying to make sense of it. The gravel crunched under the tires as I shifted into park, the sound a harsh reminder that I was no longer on familiar ground. I stared at the map for what felt like an eternity, but nothing changed. It was as if the paper itself had taken on a life of its own, shifting and contorting in ways that defied logic. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I'd been driving too long. But as I ran my finger over the map, I realized that the lines weren't just different, they were wrong. The places that should have been marked clearly were obscured, as though something was deliberately trying to hide them. The thought unsettled me more than I cared to admit. My mind raced, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Perhaps I'd taken a wrong turn earlier, though I couldn't remember doing so. Perhaps the GPS in the car was malfunctioning. It was an older model after all, and sometimes these things just happen. But as I looked up from the map, the unease only grew. I wasn't alone. I could feel it. The air felt dense, thick with an unseen presence. The faint sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves had ceased. The silence was absolute. Even the wind had stopped moving. The only sound was the occasional hum of the car's engine and the steady beating of my own heart. My eyes darted around, scanning the road behind me and the trees that stretched endlessly into the darkening forest. There was no movement, no sign of life. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising panic. I wasn't some paranoid fool. I had driven through remote areas before. There was nothing unusual about a quiet mountain road. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing sense that something wasn't right. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around, to go back the way I came. But I couldn't do that. Not yet. I'd come this far. I had to keep going. I started the car again, the engine sputtering to life with a low growl. I shifted into drive and slowly pulled back onto the road, keeping my eyes fixed ahead, trying to ignore the prickle of discomfort that crawled up my spine. But the farther I drove, the more intense the feeling became. The road seemed to shift beneath me, as though the very earth was moving. The trees loomed taller, their branches intertwining overhead, forming a canopy that blocked out most of the remaining sunlight. And then I saw it. A figure, not far from the side of the road, just enough for my eyes to catch in the dimming light. At first, I thought it was a person, standing still, watching me as I passed. But as I blinked, the figure disappeared, vanished into the shadows of the trees. I slammed on the brakes, the car jerking to a halt. My heart raced in my chest as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to steady my breath. I glanced nervously at the rearview mirror. Nothing. No figure. No movement. Just the same empty road behind me. My hands trembled as I placed the car in park once more. I wasn't imagining things. I knew what I saw. But what the hell was it? Had I really seen a person standing out there, or had my mind simply started playing tricks on me? I wasn't sure how long I sat there, the silence pressing in around me. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was seeing things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching, waiting. I decided to move on, to push past whatever it was that had triggered my nerves. But just as I was about to drive away, something else caught my eye. A small, worn sign barely visible through the trees. It was one of those road signs you'd find marking a remote path, the kind that didn't appear on most maps. I hadn't noticed it when I passed earlier. In fact, I wasn't sure how I could have missed it. It was old, its edges frayed and curling, the letters faded with time. But as I focused on it, I saw the words clearly. Dead Man's Hollow. I blinked, unsure of what I was seeing. My breath hitched as a chill ran through me. I hadn't passed any signs like that on the way here, and yet there it was, right in front of me. Dead Man's Hollow. What kind of name was that for a place? Why hadn't I seen it before? I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. The road I was on didn't match the route on my map. The figure I saw didn't make sense. And now, this? It felt like I was being pulled into something I couldn't escape. But I didn't know what to do. I could turn around, go back the way I came. But something in me, the same part of me that had pushed me to take this trip in the first place, urged me to keep going. To see where the road led, even if I didn't understand it. I drove forward, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. The trees seemed to close in around me, the road narrowing even further. The shadows deepened as I moved deeper into the woods, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was following me, just out of sight. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The cabin. The one I'd been searching for. It was just up ahead. But something was off. The closer I got, the more I realized it didn't look like the one from the pictures. This was no longer just a quiet road trip. Something had changed. Something had taken hold of me, and I didn't know how to stop it. As I pressed on, the sense of unease began to creep into every moment. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the mountain road. I hadn't seen another car in hours, and the only sound was the faint hum of the tires on the asphalt. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating stretches of road that seemed to go on forever. I glanced at the map again, and the strange, unfamiliar route stared back at me like a silent challenge. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that I'd gotten too caught up in the weirdness of the day. It wasn't uncommon for maps to be slightly out of date, and maybe I'd just taken a wrong turn somewhere. But the feeling that something was off didn't go away. In fact, it was only getting worse. I pulled over at a small pull-off to take a break. There was a dilapidated wooden sign at the edge of the road, its words barely legible under layers of weathered paint. I didn't recognize the name of the place, but that wasn't the part that bothered me. It was the way the air felt, thick, almost oppressive. I stepped out of the car and was immediately hit by the cold, crisp air. The mountains loomed large around me, their jagged peaks silhouetted against the fading sky. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees, but it felt like the forest was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, hidden just out of sight. I shrugged it off as a natural reaction to being so far from civilization, so isolated. But as I stood there, staring into the woods, I thought I heard something. A soft, distant noise that almost sounded like footsteps. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound was gone. The forest was eerily silent again. I quickly got back in the car, my heart pounding in my chest. My palms were sweaty, and I couldn't seem to get the thought out of my head that I wasn't alone out here. Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but it didn't feel that way. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and a chill ran through me. I started the car and pulled back onto the road, but the unease lingered. With each mile that passed, the surroundings grew darker, and the map in my hand seemed more and more out of place. The road twisted and turned, and there was no sign of any town or cabin, just trees and darkness. The map seemed to shift, almost like it was alive. The lines weren't as crisp as before, the roads stretching and folding in on themselves. I began to feel dizzy, as if I was being pulled into a maze that I couldn't escape. The headlights illuminated shapes in the distant shapes that seemed to flicker and disappear when I tried to focus on them. I shook my head, trying to clear the growing fog in my mind, but it didn't help. Something was definitely wrong. That's when I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. It was just a silhouette at first, standing motionless in the darkness. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of a person, as still as the trees around them. I slowed the car down, heart racing in my chest. Was it someone in trouble? Or was it just my imagination? The figure didn't move. In fact, it felt as though the figure wasn't even real, like it was a part of the landscape, a shadow that had taken human form. I passed it slowly, trying not to stare, but my eyes kept darting back to it, unable to break the hold it had on me. When I finally looked away, I glanced back at the road. My headlights illuminated something else, something far worse. A road sign, completely different from the ones I'd seen earlier. This one was worn, as if it had been here for decades, its metal surface rusted and bent. The sign read, "Dead End." I slammed on the brakes, heart racing. That wasn't right. The cabin was just a few miles away, or at least it should have been. My hands trembled as I gripped the wheel, staring at the sign. I was too far in now. I had to turn back, but the road didn't feel like it was going to let me. My eyes darted back to the map. The lines had changed again. The road ahead was now showing a completely new direction, a direction I hadn't seen before. I looked out the window again, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. The figure. It was walking toward me, slowly, with deliberate steps. I couldn't make out its face, but the way it moved was unnatural. It was almost as if it didn't belong to this world. The moment felt frozen in time. My foot was still on the brake, but I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the figure's steady approach. I had to get out of there. The air in the car had become thick with tension as I continued to drive. The map, which once seemed like a harmless piece of paper, now felt like a guide to a twisted fate. The road I was on didn't seem to end, it just kept stretching out, twisting through the dense forest, with no sign of the cabin I was supposed to reach. The hours ticked by, and still I saw no signs of civilization. By now, I was both exhausted and scared. The sun had completely disappeared behind the mountain peaks, and I was driving in the dark with only the headlights illuminating the road ahead. The radio had long since died, leaving only the sound of tires crunching against the gravel. I pulled over to the side of the road, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't go any further. My hands gripped the wheel tightly as I stared at the map, trying to make sense of the directions. The map still showed a path, but the further I looked at it, the more I realized it was changing, just like the road I had been traveling on. I stepped out of the car, hoping to get some air and clear my head. The cold night air hit me like a shock, and I instinctively pulled my jacket tighter around me. The forest surrounding me was eerily silent. No wind, no rustling of leaves, just complete stillness. It was unnatural, the kind of silence that presses on you like a weight. I walked to the edge of the road, trying to get a better look at my surroundings. The trees loomed tall and thick, casting long shadows in the dim light. But in the distance, through the trees, I saw something. A faint glow, just a pinpoint of light. I wasn't sure if it was a reflection or something more, but I decided to head toward it. With every step I took, I felt the distance between me and the car grow longer, and the weight of uncertainty pressed on my chest. It was as though I was moving deeper into a place that didn't want me to leave. I couldn't explain it, but it felt wrong, like the trees themselves were watching me. As I neared the source of the light, I realized it wasn't a reflection at all. It was a small, flickering lantern hanging from a post, almost hidden among the thick branches of the trees. I took a few more steps forward, my breath shallow, and reached the post. The lantern was old rusted iron with a dim, flickering flame inside. But what caught my attention wasn't the lantern. It was the sign beneath it. The wood was weathered, the paint peeling, but I could still make out the words carved into it. "Turn back." I froze. My mind raced, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't some old roadside marker or a forgotten signpost. This was a message, a warning. But from whom? And why? The last shred of rationality told me to turn around and go back to the car. But the feeling of being drawn in, of being unable to resist the pull of whatever was happening, kept me rooted to the spot. I took a step back, heart pounding. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of here. But just as I turned around to head back, I heard it. A noise. Not a whisper, not a shout, but something else, something too quiet, too distant to make sense of a rustling sound, like something or someone moving through the trees, just beyond my sight. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The light from the lantern flickered, casting strange shadows, and for a moment, I thought I saw something moving between the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. I ran. The trees rushed past me as I pushed through the underbrush, ignoring the sharp branches that scratched at my arms. I didn't look back. I couldn't. By the time I reached the car, I was out of breath, my heart racing, and my mind swimming with terror. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and gripped the wheel again, my knuckles white. I had to leave. I had to get out of here. I started the engine, my hands shaking. The road ahead was still unclear, but I didn't care. I just needed to go. The light from the lantern seemed to follow me, casting strange shadows in my rearview mirror. The trees seemed to close in as I sped down the road, the forest swallowing the car whole. Hours passed, but I didn't stop. My eyes burned from exhaustion, but I couldn't sleep. I couldn't close my eyes, not even for a second. The fear had taken over, and I was driven by nothing more than instinct to get away, get far, and never come back. Finally, as dawn broke, I saw the first signs of civilization, a small gas station in the distance. I didn't care if I had to take a detour. I didn't care if I was way off track. I was just happy to see something familiar. I pulled in without thinking, the car rolling to a stop in front of the gas pump. I got out, my legs unsteady. My body felt like it was made of stone, heavy and worn down from the night's journey. The clerk inside gave me a strange look as I walked in, but I didn't care. I needed to get away from those woods, from whatever I had encountered. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Do you have any maps?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Maps to the nearest town, maybe?" The clerk didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, as though he was waiting for me to explain further. But I didn't feel like talking. Not then. Finally, he grabbed a map from under the counter and handed it to me. As I unfolded it, I noticed something strange. The road I had been following, the one on the map from the rental car, was missing. There was no trace of it. It was as if the road I had driven down had never existed at all. I felt my stomach drop. I looked back at the clerk. He was still staring at me, his expression unreadable. I grabbed the map and left. I didn't need to know why the road was gone. I didn't need to know what happened last night. I just needed to get home, where things made sense. But as I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That I hadn't really left the woods at all. That whatever had been watching me was still there, waiting. As I stood there, looking back at the road I had just traveled, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The mountains, now bathed in the dim light of the setting sun, seemed to press in from all sides, a silent, unyielding presence. The gravel beneath my shoes felt unsettlingly solid, as if it had been laid there specifically to trap me. My eyes kept wandering back to the rental car, now parked just off the road, its headlights casting long shadows across the empty terrain. There was no sign of the other travelers, no sound beyond the soft wind rustling the leaves in the trees. I had escaped. In some way, that was enough to provide a sense of relief. The map had led me to a strange, isolated location, far beyond the confines of anything I had planned. That final revelation, the uncanny pull of the path it forced me to take, was enough to leave me with the unmistakable feeling that I had narrowly avoided something dark, something that had no place in the world I knew. But was that truly the end? In my mind, I replayed the moments I had spent in that car. The way the air had thickened, how the trees had seemed to twist unnaturally in the shadows. I thought about the odd markings on the map, the roads that shouldn't have existed, and how the more I tried to escape them, the more they seemed to chase me. Those quiet nights in the cabin, the strange sensations when I ventured too far from the warmth of the fire. It all had an eerie sense of closure now, as if the mountain was letting me go. The soft hum of the engine on my return journey was like the final note of a song that had been haunting me all along. But there were still so many unanswered questions. What was the significance of the road I had been led to? Why had that map shown me something so completely unfamiliar? Was it just a glitch in the system, or had I stumbled into something deeper? The fear I had felt wasn't rooted in a single event. It had been a creeping, insidious terror that had wrapped itself around my mind. It was the feeling that something had been waiting, something that had almost found me. I tried to ignore the doubt gnawing at me, but I couldn't. What if I wasn't supposed to leave? What if the path I'd taken through miles of darkening forest and endless stretches of empty road hadn't been an accident? There was a part of me that knew, deep down, that the mystery of the map and the strange route weren't things I could simply walk away from. I knew that whatever forces had guided me down that road, whatever entity or energy had quietly watched from the shadows, would never fully let me go. As the car's engine purred back to life, I glanced once more at the mountains that loomed ahead. The road to my left had vanished into a dense thicket of trees, a place I had intentionally left behind. but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe that road had been my destination all along. And if I had gone any further, would I have found something worse waiting for me in the dark? With a deep breath, I hit the gas, the wheels crunching over the gravel as I made my way down the road. But no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't outrun the memories. Every turn, every shadow, every strange twist in the path lingered in my thoughts. I couldn't tell if they were a result of my fear, or if there truly had been something more of presence in the mountains that I had narrowly escaped. The further I drove, the more the road seemed to stretch on forever, as though it didn't want me to leave. The lights of the rental car's dashboard flickered for a moment, and I wondered if I'd ever truly get out of the mountains. Would I keep driving in circles, perpetually on the road that led me nowhere? And then, just as I rounded another bend in the road, I saw it, a figure standing in the distance, barely visible through the fog that had settled over the valley. My heart stopped. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge the headlights shining in its direction. It just stood there, still as stone. My hand tightened around the wheel, the grip almost painful. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the light, a person lost in the fog. But my instincts screamed otherwise. I accelerated, pushing the car faster as the figure remained frozen in place. The fog thickened, and I couldn't see clearly. Every part of me wanted to slam on the brakes, turn around, but I didn't. Something kept me driving forward, even as the hairs on my neck stood on end. The figure was now gone, swallowed by the mist as if it had never been there at all. The rest of the drive passed in a blur. I didn't stop to refuel, didn't pause to take a break. I drove straight through, the world outside reduced to a hazy blur of headlights and shadow. The mountain road had finally given way to something more familiar, but I couldn't shake the thought that something else had been left behind, something that would follow me for the rest of my life. In the end, I returned the rental car, clean and unscathed, at least on the outside. But I knew the truth. Whatever had started on that road wasn't truly finished. I had taken the path the map had shown me, and while I might have escaped, I couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain, that strange, winding road, would always have a hold on me. Some mysteries, I've learned, don't end when you think they do. They linger, waiting for the right moment to return, reminding you of something you'd rather forget. The year was 2018, and I was living in a small yet bustling city that never seemed to sleep. I had a relatively normal routine work, then back home. But every now and then, my schedule would stretch into the late hours, and I'd find myself on the last train back to my apartment. This was one of those nights. It was past midnight, and I was tired from a long day, desperate to get home and collapse into bed. I had been working at an office downtown for the past 3 years. The city was a mix of modern skyscrapers and older, more historic buildings. I lived on the outskirts, where the atmosphere shifted from urban excitement to quiet residential streets. It wasn't the ideal commute. The train ride could be a little too long for my liking, but it was something I had gotten used to. The train was the fastest way to get home after those late-night office shifts. On this particular night, I was the last person left on the platform as I waited for the final train of the evening. It was a chilly evening, with the scent of fresh rain lingering in the air. I zipped up my jacket as the train's headlights appeared in the distance. A soft sigh of relief escaped me as I thought of the warmth and comfort that awaited me at home. The train pulled into the station, and the automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh. The train car was almost completely empty. There was a man sitting near the front, hunched over his phone, and a couple of people scattered throughout the car, all too tired to acknowledge one another. I found a seat towards the back, leaning my head against the window as the train started moving. The city lights flickered outside, creating a steady rhythm as I zoned out. The hum of the train was calming. I was used to these late-night rides, and the peace of an almost empty car had always been something I appreciated. The city was far behind me, and I knew I'd be asleep as soon as I got into bed. The routine of it all, the train, the empty stations, the quiet, it was all part of my life. I glanced at the time on my phone. It was 12:25 a.m. Not much longer now. As the train made its way through the darkened landscape, I felt my eyelids growing heavy. But before I could drift off, something strange caught my attention. At first, it was subtle. A strange sound, something like a soft scraping noise, came from the back of the train. I couldn't place it, but it definitely wasn't the usual clatter of the wheels on the tracks. The sound didn't seem to fit in with the normal hum of the ride. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe the train was just a little old, or there was some debris caught under it. But then, a flicker of light in the corner of my eye made me look up. One of the overhead lights had gone out. It wasn't unusual for the train's lights to flicker from time to time, but this one stayed off. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that started to creep in. I wasn't a superstitious person, and I wasn't prone to overthinking things, but there was something off. I glanced around the car, noticing that the few people still on board seemed completely oblivious to the oddities I was starting to pick up on. The man at the front was still scrolling on his phone, and the couple were quietly chatting. No one else seemed to be paying attention. I leaned back against the seat again, trying to relax. Maybe it was the exhaustion getting to me. I closed my eyes for a moment, hoping I could just ignore whatever weirdness was happening. But that's when I heard it again. A soft scrape, almost like something or someone was moving across the floor of the train. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but I couldn't ignore it this time. I opened my eyes and looked around. The car was still mostly empty, but now it felt quieter. It was as if the noise of the city outside had suddenly disappeared, and the only sound was the train's rhythmic movement. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The scrape continued, and now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was definitely wrong. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was just the train a little old, maybe with some wear and tear. The scrape could have been anything, really. Maybe a metal piece shifting under the weight of the car, or something caught under one of the seats. But as the sound persisted, my mind started to wander, and the unease began to build. I glanced around again, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. The man at the front of the car was still hunched over his phone, his face illuminated by the screen. He seemed completely oblivious to the odd sound, or maybe he was simply too tired to notice. The couple sitting near the middle of the car didn't seem to be affected either. They were having a quiet conversation, their voices barely rising above the hum of the train. The normalcy of the scene was disorienting, but I couldn't deny the sense of something strange hanging in the air. Then, the scrape came again, louder this time. It wasn't just a fleeting sound. It was like something or someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I froze, my body stiffening as I tried to focus on the sound. The lights flickered again, this time more noticeably, causing me to flinch. I quickly glanced up, but the overhead lights returned to their usual dim glow, almost as if nothing had happened. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying to rationalize what was going on. Maybe it was the late hour or my overactive imagination, but the tension in the air was palpable. I looked at my phone for reassurance, checking the time again. 12:35 a.m. Only a few more stops to go. I could make it. I tried to focus on the soft chatter of the couple in the middle, the rhythmic clattering of the train on the tracks, and the steady thrum of the train's engine. It should have been enough to calm my racing thoughts, but it wasn't. The scraping noise stopped. Just like that, it was gone. The sudden silence felt heavy. I exhaled in relief, allowing myself to believe it was just some mechanical glitch, nothing more. But as I relaxed, I couldn't help but notice that the car was a little too still. The couple had stopped talking. The man at the front was no longer on his phone. He was looking straight ahead, his posture rigid. I glanced around, trying to make sense of the scene. Was it just me, or had the temperature dropped? I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself in an attempt to shake off the sudden chill. The couple was now unnaturally quiet, not even exchanging a glance. Their eyes were focused straight ahead, their bodies tense. I was just about to turn my attention back to the window when the scraping sound returned. But this time, it was different. It was much closer, and it sounded as though it was coming from right behind me. I couldn't help myself. I whipped around, half expecting to see something behind me. But there was nothing. The empty seats, the quiet car, it all seemed so ordinary. Yet, the sensation of being watched was undeniable. My heart began to race as I turned back to face forward. My fingers gripped the edge of the seat, knuckles white. I could feel the tension growing in the air, the strange heaviness that seemed to settle in the car. I wasn't the only one who noticed it now. The couple shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and the man at the front adjusted his position, his eyes darting nervously around the car. I could feel their unease in the silence that followed, and it was like the entire atmosphere in the car had shifted. Then, out of nowhere, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't return to normal. One of the lights at the back of the car blinked out, followed by another. The darkness crept in, and for a brief moment, I couldn't see anything except for the faint glow of the train's emergency lights. My breath caught in my throat, and I strained my eyes to adjust to the dim light. I glanced over at the man near the front of the car. He was still staring ahead, but now his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. I could tell he was no longer focused on his phone. The couple, too, were now looking around, their faces reflecting the same unease I felt. The car was growing colder, and the silence was deafening. That was when I noticed something even stranger. In the brief moment of darkness, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing at the end of the car. It was blurry at first, like a shadow, but it quickly became more distinct. A tall figure, draped in a long coat, standing motionless at the back of the car. I blinked, and the figure was gone. My breath hitched. I quickly scanned the car, looking for anything any sign that I had imagined it. But there was nothing. Just the empty seats, the couple staring ahead, and the man at the front, his posture even more rigid than before. The air felt heavier now, as though it had thickened with an unspoken tension. I looked out the window, trying to calm myself, but all I could see was darkness. The train was passing through an area with no lights, no buildings, just the endless stretch of tracks cutting through the wilderness. My eyes kept darting back to the end of the car. Was I seeing things? Or was something truly out of place? I couldn't help myself, I had to know. Slowly, I stood up, my legs trembling slightly as I made my way toward the back of the car. The others didn't seem to notice. They were all too focused on the strange atmosphere, their eyes locked straight ahead, their bodies unnaturally stiff. As I reached the end of the car, I glanced behind me. There was nothing. No figure. No movement. The car was empty, just as it had been moments ago. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and turned back toward the seats. But before I could sit down, I felt something cold brush against my neck. My heart stopped and I spun around, but there was nothing. The cold lingered like a presence, but I was alone. The scrape came again this time. It was louder. It sounded almost as if it were coming from beneath the floorboards, a dragging noise like nails scraping against metal. My entire body went rigid. The sound grew louder, more urgent, and yet the others in the car remained still. They were all too quiet now. I could hear their shallow breaths, but no one moved, not a single one of them. I took a step back, my mind racing. What was happening? Was this just a coincidence, or was there something far more sinister going on? The sound of the scrape had become more frequent, now echoing through the car like a slow, rhythmic beat that reverberated in my bones. The first time, I thought it was a coincidence, maybe just the usual creaks and groans of an old train. But now, I couldn't ignore it. It felt intentional, like something or someone was trying to get my attention. The air around me seemed to thicken, pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. The temperature had dropped so suddenly, I could see my breath in front of me. I pulled my coat tighter, but the cold still seeped through. It wasn't just the temperature. There was an eerie weight in the air, as if something were pressing against the walls of the train, pulling at my sanity. I glanced around, but the passengers were still oddly still, their faces blank, their eyes unfocused. They weren't reacting to the oddities around us. It was as if they were in a trance, stuck in a moment where time didn't seem to move. The scraping sound was no longer subtle. It was louder, more persistent. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever was happening to unfold. I stood up, my legs shaky from the sudden rush of adrenaline. The man at the front of the car hadn't moved. His head was tilted slightly to the side, as if he were listening to something, his eyes wide and fixed on some unseen point in the distance. The couple in the middle was still frozen, not a single word spoken between them, their hands clenched in their laps. I moved cautiously toward the back of the car again, my footsteps muted by the strange quiet of the train. The scrape continued, and the air grew colder with each step. It was like walking through a tunnel of darkness, the flickering lights casting long, erratic shadows on the walls. The shadows seemed to shift unnaturally, moving just out of the corner of my eye, vanishing the moment I focused on them. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing moved. It was just the empty seats, the strange atmosphere. Reaching the back of the car, I hesitated. The scraping sound was louder here, more distinct. It felt like it was coming from below, like something was dragging itself along the floor beneath the metal flooring. I crouched down, pressing my ear to the cold metal of the floor. The sound was unmistakable now. It wasn't just random noises of the train. It was deliberate, like claws scraping across the surface, trying to claw its way out. My heart hammered in my chest, and I quickly stood up, stumbling backward. As I retreated, I noticed the lights flickering again. This time, they didn't return to their usual dim glow. The flicker lingered, and with it came a strange distortion in the air, like the world around me was warping. The edges of my vision blurred for a moment, and I had to blink rapidly to clear it. When my eyes refocused, everything seemed different. The car felt farther away, as if the walls had receded. The seats were farther apart, the space between passengers stretching like elastic. My breath caught in my throat as I turned quickly to look at the other passengers. The man at the front of the car was no longer sitting. He was standing now, his back to the seats, staring at the door to the next car with an expression of sheer terror. His mouth was slightly open, and I could hear his shallow, panicked breaths. But there was no sound in the car. The scrape had stopped. The eerie silence returned, and I felt my own heart slowing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. I stepped toward him, my voice low and cautious. "Are you okay?" His eyes didn't even shift to acknowledge me. They remained locked on the door. It's not supposed to be here," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked like he was about to break, like whatever he had seen, whatever was going on, was too much for him. I took another step forward, feeling the air press tighter against me, suffocating. The tension was unbearable. "What's going on?" I asked, but he didn't respond. He simply turned and began to walk toward the door, his steps unsteady, as if he were sleepwalking. I reached out to grab his arm, but when I touched him, he jolted back as though I had burned him. His eyes finally met mine, wide with fear. "You don't want to go through that door," he said, his voice trembling. You can't leave this car." I tried to speak, to ask what he meant, but the words caught in my throat. The car had grown unbearably cold, and the air seemed to grow thicker with every passing second. My skin prickled, and I felt something in the air, something heavy, something watching me. But before I could respond, the lights flickered once more, and everything went pitch black. For a moment, I was frozen in darkness. The kind of darkness that feels alive, the kind that presses in on you, suffocating every breath, every thought. I could feel my pulse pounding in my neck, the adrenaline surging through me as I waited for the lights to return. When they did, the man was gone. My stomach dropped as I scanned the car. He wasn't in his seat. He wasn't anywhere. The seats were empty now, save for the couple in the middle, who hadn't moved an inch, their expressions vacant. I turned back to the door that he had been staring at so intensely. It was closed, locked, the same as it had been when I first boarded. But something was different now. The door looked wrong. The metal was darker, almost black, and there was a faint stain at the bottom, like something had been dragged against it. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know what was going on. I needed to understand. My heart hammered in my chest as I moved toward the door, my breath shallow and uneven. I reached for the handle, but before I could touch it, the scraping sound came again, louder this time, almost deafening. I spun around, my eyes scanning the car in panic, but there was nothing. Only the silence. Then it hit me. The scraping wasn't coming from below anymore. It was coming from the walls. The metal walls of the train, groaning and creaking, as though something was moving within them. Something large, something strong. I could feel the vibration of it in the floor beneath my feet, in my teeth, in my chest. The scraping continued, rhythmic, deliberate, as if it were drawing closer, closing in on me. I reached for the door handle once more, but this time I didn't hesitate. I pulled it open. The cold hit me first, a gust of frigid air rushing in from the unknown. And then I saw it. The thing standing in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body thin and stretched, its face obscured by a dark hood. Its hands were long, too long, fingers ending in sharp, twisted nails. It didn't move at first. It just stood there, staring at me with eyes that I couldn't see, but I felt them. I felt them boring into me, like it was reading me, understanding me, seeing into the deepest parts of my soul. I froze, my body rigid with fear, unable to move, unable to breathe. The scraping noise had stopped, but the oppressive silence was worse. It felt like the train had stopped moving, like time itself had frozen in place. Then, the figure took a step forward. The moment the figure stepped forward, I was paralyzed, my body frozen in place by an overwhelming surge of fear that gripped my chest. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the dark silhouette standing in the doorway. The cold air that had rushed in with it seemed to carry a weight of its own, suffocating me with each passing second. I wanted to scream, to run, but my limbs wouldn't obey. The figure, still standing perfectly still, tilted its head to the side, as if studying me. Its form was skeletal, its long, bony fingers twitching ever so slightly, as if anticipating something. I could feel the blood drain from my face as I stared at it. My mind screamed at me to move, but my body betrayed me, rooted to the spot as though some unseen force had a grip on me. Then, the silence shattered with the sound of that scraping noise again, this time so loud it made my ears ring. It was coming from behind me, from the very walls of the train itself. I felt the vibrations under my feet, the sensation of something massive, something terrifying, scraping and dragging itself along the metal, getting closer and closer. The figure in the doorway did not flinch, did not react, just stood there, unwavering. I couldn't understand it. I couldn't process what was happening. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible, but nothing fit. There was no explanation, no logic to this nightmare. I was trapped on a train that was no longer simply a train. It had become a prison, a place where reality itself seemed to bend and break. And the figure in front of me? It was not human. It was something else, something far worse. Without warning, the figure moved again. Slowly, deliberately, it took another step forward, crossing the threshold of the door and into the car. The air around it shimmered, as though reality itself was bending and warping with each movement. The lights flickered violently, casting harsh, erratic shadows that danced across the walls and floor. For the first time, I saw the creature's face, or rather, the lack of one. It wasn't just that its face was covered in shadow. It was as if its very face had been erased, wiped clean, leaving nothing but a smooth, featureless surface where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. I could feel its gaze, though, even without a face. Its presence was suffocating, like it was reading my every thought, peeling back the layers of my mind, exposing my most vulnerable parts. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind screaming at me to get away. But there was nowhere to go. The door I had opened, the door to the next car, was now gone. The walls of the train had closed in, trapping me in this godforsaken car with this thing. The thing didn't move any closer. Instead, it raised one of its impossibly long arms and pointed a finger directly at me. The gesture was slow, deliberate, like it was marking me for something. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The world felt suspended, frozen in time. The scraping sound had stopped, and all I could hear was my ragged breathing, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then it spoke. The voice was not a voice at all. It was a feeling, a presence that permeated my mind, sliding into my thoughts like a cold, creeping shadow. It didn't speak with words, but with intentions, with a knowing that I couldn't escape. "You are not meant to be here," it said, its voice echoing inside my skull. The words weren't spoken aloud. They felt like they came from deep within me, as if my own mind was betraying me. "You cannot leave. You cannot wait." I wanted to shout, to run, but I couldn't. It was like my very body was in the grip of some unseen force, frozen in terror. The words kept swirling in my head, a constant, insidious whisper. "You cannot wait." My stomach churned as the realization hit me like a hammer. This wasn't just a nightmare. This wasn't some strange, fleeting experience. No, this was real. This was happening. And whatever this thing was, it wasn't just here to haunt me, it was here to claim me. I felt my legs give out, my knees buckling beneath me as I collapsed to the floor, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The air was thick with fear, with the weight of something terrible that was closing in on me. The creature's hand moved, and I felt a coldness brush against my skin, as though its fingers were just inches away from me. I flinched back, but there was nowhere to retreat. The train car had become a cage, and I was its prey. And then it happened. The scraping sound started again, but this time it was not coming from the walls. It was coming from the very floor beneath me. The metal of the train groaned, and I could feel something stirring beneath it, something large, something powerful. The train itself seemed to shudder, as if it were alive, as if it were reacting to the presence of the creature in the doorway. I could feel it now, whatever it was, slithering beneath me. The sensation was grotesque, like something cold and slimy was crawling up my legs, up my spine. It was no longer a sound. It was a physical presence, something that was crawling up from the depths, dragging itself toward me. I screamed. The creature in front of me didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to notice. Its attention was solely fixed on me, its fingers still pointing, its invisible gaze still piercing through my mind. I could feel its presence in every fiber of my being, a suffocating weight pressing down on me, leaving me no room to breathe, no room to think. And then the lights went out. For a split second, there was nothing, only darkness, cold and unyielding. The oppressive weight that had been hanging over me suddenly lifted, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I had escaped. But then the darkness was pierced by a single, blinding flash of light. The train car was gone. I was no longer on the train. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark, somewhere far worse. The figure was still there, but now it was not alone. The train had become a place of horrors, a twisted nightmare where nothing was what it seemed. The figure was not the only one waiting for me. There were others, shadows in the corners of the room, eyes gleaming from the darkness. They were watching, waiting, and I realized with a bone-deep horror that I had never truly left the train. I was still on it, still trapped, and whatever I had seen, whatever I had felt, was only the beginning. The nightmare was far from over. The walls began to close in again, tighter, smaller. The scraping sound grew louder. This time, there would be no escape. The oppressive silence of the train car felt suffocating. I was no longer able to distinguish what was real and what was an illusion. The lights flickered sporadically, casting brief moments of clarity, but they only revealed more of the dark, looming figures that had filled the space around me. I was surrounded, trapped, there was no escaping them. They were all around me, their presence tangible, as though the air itself had thickened, weighed down by their relentless gaze. I wasn't sure how long I had been sitting there, paralyzed by fear, but every second felt like an eternity. The figure that had first entered the car remained in the doorway, its featureless face staring blankly at me, its bony fingers still pointed directly at me, accusing me of something I couldn't understand. The other figures, who had emerged from the corners of the car, moved in unsettling synchrony, circling me slowly, their presence unyielding and suffocating. I knew I had to move, but I couldn't. The scraping sound that had been haunting the train now grew louder, echoing in my head. It felt as though the very walls of the train were closing in on me. The train itself seemed to be groaning, as if it were alive, fighting against its fate. It was no longer just a vehicle moving along the tracks. It was a twisted, macabre prison. I wanted to scream again, to lash out at the shadows that surrounded me, but something kept me grounded, a terrible sense of resignation creeping in. There was no escaping this place, no way to flee from the nightmare that had become my reality. I had been brought here for a reason, and I knew deep down that there was nothing I could do to change that. Then, the figure in the doorway began to move again, its long skeletal form gliding silently toward me. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. I was rooted in place, unable to escape the pull of the entity's presence. As it drew closer, the temperature in the car dropped even further. I could feel the icy cold creeping up my spine, seeping into my bones. My breath fogged in front of me, a visible reminder of how deep the chill had become. It was then that I heard it, the voice. Not in my mind this time, but spoken aloud, its tone low and unnervingly calm. "You cannot leave," it said. I felt its words wash over me, wrapping themselves around my consciousness, pressing down on me until I thought I might suffocate from the sheer weight of them. The figure moved closer, its bony fingers extending toward me. I could feel my heart racing, my chest tightening with fear, but still I couldn't move. Just as I thought I might lose all control, something shifted. It wasn't a physical movement, but a sudden, jarring break in the atmosphere. The air seemed to tremble, and then, with an unnatural force, the lights in the car flickered one last time before going completely dark. A deafening silence followed. For a moment, I wondered if I had finally gone mad. But the silence was broken once more by the scraping noise that had plagued me throughout the ordeal. Only this time, it was different. The sound was no longer just a distant echo. It was closing in on me, surrounding me from all sides. It was as though the very train was tearing itself apart, the metal groaning and twisting under some unseen force. I could feel it now, in the very air around me, the pull of something beyond human comprehension. Something ancient. Something wrong. I gasped, suddenly aware that I was no longer alone in the car. I turned toward the back, where the shadows had gathered, only to see that the figures had disappeared. The train car, once so full of their presence, was now eerily empty, save for the lingering cold that hung in the air like a fog. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly stood, my legs unsteady. I couldn't understand what had just happened. Had they left? Had I finally escaped whatever nightmare had been chasing me? Or had it all been some twisted trick of my mind? In the darkness, I heard the faintest noise like a whisper, but it wasn't a whisper in the traditional sense. It was more like a presence in my mind, pressing in on me, filling the void left by the silence. "You can't escape," it said. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but the voice didn't come from the air around me. It was inside my head, as if the words were seeded directly into my consciousness. I tried to steady myself, shaking my head in an attempt to clear it. I stumbled toward the door of the train car, desperate to escape. My fingers fumbled with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Trapped. The scraping noise returned, louder now, and I could feel the vibrations under my feet, as though the very train was alive with the movement of something monstrous beneath it. I felt the pressure building in my chest again, the crushing weight of an unknown force that was closing in on me. But then, a crackling sound filled the air, a burst of static. The lights flickered back on for a brief moment, and I saw it. The train. The real train, the one that was supposed to be on its tracks, moving toward the station. I blinked, confused, disoriented. The scene had shifted once again. The cold, empty car was gone. I was now back in a familiar space, a train station platform, bathed in the harsh glow of overhead lights. But it didn't feel right. The world around me was too still. The station was eerily quiet, the usual bustle of passengers nowhere to be found. Only the faint hum of the lights filled the air. I stepped off the train, my legs unsteady beneath me, and looked around. It was late. The station was almost entirely deserted. But as I walked toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain what had happened. Was it real? Had I imagined it all? There were too many questions, too many uncertainties. But one thing was clear. Whatever it was, it had left its mark on me. The encounter, whatever it had been, had changed something within me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just brushed up against something that was not meant to be understood, something that was beyond my comprehension. I had escaped the train, but I wasn't sure I would ever truly escape what had happened on it. The voices, the figures, the scraping sound all lingered in the back of my mind, haunting me even as I walked away. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I turned back to look at the train one last time. But it was gone. No train, no station, nothing. Just the empty road stretching out before me, and the distant sound of scraping. I walked on, hoping that whatever had happened would stay behind me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. It's strange, how quickly you can adapt to something as unnatural as fear. How you can learn to live with it, carry it with you like a shadow that never quite lets you go. The world has a way of changing you, twisting you into something unrecognizable. But that train ride, that night, something in me shifted in ways I can't explain. That night, I had left the station, walked away from the train, and stood there in the cold, unsure of where the real world began and where the nightmare ended. It wasn't like anything I'd ever felt before, the disconnect between reality and the impossible. I was no longer sure of the boundaries between them. I'd always thought of myself as a practical person, someone who could sift through the illogical and find a reason, a justification. But after everything that happened that night, I knew there were forces beyond what I could rationalize. The train station that greeted me when I stepped off the train wasn't the one I boarded at. The platform felt unfamiliar, almost foreign, even though I recognized the street signs and the tall buildings that loomed nearby. The station itself appeared to have aged significantly in the time I'd spent aboard that cursed train yet. I couldn't say how much time had truly passed. An hour? A day? But the time didn't matter. It was what had happened during that hour, that moment of madness, that was now at the forefront of my mind. And for the first time, I understood what people meant when they said something had changed them forever. It was no longer just a phrase. It had become my truth. I tried to push the thoughts away, tried to convince myself that it was over. That the train, the figures, the voices, all of it was just a figment of my exhausted mind. After all, I had been tired. Long hours at work, the stress of life, and a few too many sleepless nights. I could have imagined it, right? But something inside me knew better. That feeling, that knowing deep within the pit of my stomach, it was still there, lurking just below the surface, refusing to let me believe the illusion of normalcy I so desperately wanted to cling to. I didn't stay at the station long. I left quickly, the need to escape overwhelming any rational thought. My steps were hurried, my mind racing with 100 questions, all of them unanswered. What had happened? What was that place? What were those figures? Who would have been trying to reach me? When I made it home, I thought I could leave the nightmare behind. I locked my door, drew the curtains, and sank into the comfortable silence of my apartment. But it wasn't the same. The quiet, once soothing, now felt like a reminder of everything that had transpired. The flickering lights, the eerie silence, the sensation of being followed, it clung to me in ways I couldn't escape. That night, as I lay in bed, the darkness wrapped itself around me. The shadows seemed more ominous, stretching across the room like long fingers reaching for me. I tried to tell myself it was just the remnants of fear, that it would all fade away with time. But I knew it wouldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had followed me back, like a stain on my soul that could never be washed away. I awoke the next morning to the sound of my alarm, the sun shining through the blinds. A new day had begun, and for a moment, I let myself believe that everything had gone back to normal. I went through the motions, brushed my teeth, ate breakfast, checked my emails, anything to prove that the night before had been a bad dream, a series of hallucinations caused by stress and exhaustion. But as I walked out the door, ready to face the day, I felt a presence behind me. It wasn't a physical sensation, but a gnawing feeling in the back of my mind, something that tugged at the edge of my consciousness. It wasn't until I stepped outside that I fully understood it was the same presence, the same unsettling feeling that had followed me when I'd walked out of the station. The night had not ended. The nightmare hadn't been confined to the train. It was with me now. As I stood there, looking out at the street in front of me, I realized something horrifying, something that struck me with cold clarity. I wasn't the only one who had seen the train. I wasn't the only one who had boarded it. That train, whatever it had been, had left its mark on me, but not just on me. There were others. I had seen their faces, their reactions, the way they had looked at me when I entered the train car. They too had been part of it. And as I walked down the street, I saw them, those who had once sat across from me on that train, standing in the distance, watching me. Their faces were blank, their expressions hollow. I could feel their eyes on me, as though they were waiting for something, waiting for me to acknowledge them. I couldn't look back. I couldn't face them. I quickened my pace, trying to drown out the thoughts racing through my head. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid, that nothing had really changed. But I knew it wasn't true. It never was. As I turned the corner, I thought I heard the faintest sound, the scrape of metal against metal, distant but unmistakable. It was the same sound, the one that had tormented me on that cursed train. I didn't stop. I couldn't. But the sound lingered. The whispers, if that's what they were, lingered too. They followed me like a shadow, just out of sight, but never too far behind. I kept walking, my heart thudding in my chest. I had escaped the train, I thought. I had left the station, the figures, the voices behind me. But I was wrong. The train never left. It had only changed its form. And it was waiting for me, waiting to take me once again. And I didn't know if I would ever truly escape. So I walk on, always looking over my shoulder, always listening for that scrape, that whisper. I don't know when or if the train will come for me again. It was a cold fall afternoon when my friends and I decided to explore the old hospital on the outskirts of town. We'd all heard the rumors how the place had been abandoned for decades, ever since it shut down due to mysterious circumstances. People said that the building was haunted, but that was just the sort of thing you dismissed when you were a teenager looking for excitement. The hospital, as far as I knew, had been left to rot ever since it closed its doors in the 80s. It wasn't far from where we lived, maybe a 10-minute walk, but it had become a sort of forbidden place, the kind of place you heard stories about, but never actually visited. Well, until that day. I remember the drive there like it was yesterday. The sky was overcast, and the trees lining the road had started to lose their leaves, creating a blanket of yellow and brown on the ground. The air smelled damp and earthy, and there was a chill in the air that hinted at the approaching winter. We were all bundled up in jackets, our faces tinged with anticipation. This wasn't just any ordinary exploration, this was something more. We were seeking out the unknown. The group consisted of myself, Jake, and my two closest friends, Luke and Caleb. We had grown up together, and our bond had only deepened over the years. Like most teens, we had our share of rebellious moments, but none had been quite like this. We were out to prove something to each other, to ourselves, and this was the perfect challenge. To venture into the unknown, into a place that everyone whispered about, but no one dared enter. As we neared the hospital, the towering silhouette of the building grew more imposing. It loomed over the trees, a decaying monolith of forgotten history. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, but there was also a rush of excitement. It wasn't the first time we had snuck into abandoned buildings. In fact, we'd made a habit of it in the past few months, exploring old factories and vacant houses. But this place was different. The stories were different. There were legends tied to the old hospital, and it was the one location we had yet to conquer. When we finally arrived at the entrance, we were standing at the foot of a set of rusted iron gates that separated the hospital grounds from the outside world. There was no sign of life, no guards, no security, just silence. The gates were half open, as if inviting us in, but we hesitated. A strange sense of foreboding hung in the air, thicker than the fog rolling in from the nearby hills. "Are you sure about this?" Caleb asked, his voice sounding unusually unsure. He was usually the first to suggest something dangerous, but today there was hesitation in his tone. I could tell that Luke was feeling it too. Neither of them was speaking up, but I could tell from their body language that the weight of the moment had finally hit them. Still, none of us spoke about turning back. We'd made it this far, and no way was I going to let fear stop us now. With a deep breath, I pushed through the gate. The others followed me in, each of us glancing over our shoulders to check for anything that might be watching. But there was nothing, just a faint echo of our footsteps on the gravel path that led to the main entrance of the hospital. As we walked closer to the building, I noticed the windows were mostly boarded up, some of them cracked or shattered, the remnants of glass scattered like confetti on the ground. The walls were peeling, the paint faded and chipped, and vines crept up the sides like nature was slowly swallowing the structure whole. Despite the outward decay, there was something about the place that gave off a sense of eeriness. It was as if it had been frozen in time, waiting for something or someone. The front doors, made of heavy wood, were partially open. I hesitated before pushing them fully open. The sound of the hinges screeching as they moved was jarring, like the building itself was groaning under the strain. As we stepped inside, the air felt different, cooler, damp, and musty. The smell of mildew hit us immediately. It was the kind of smell that made you want to gag, but we powered through it, each of us stepping cautiously into the darkness. We weren't equipped with much, just our phones for light and the occasional flashlight we had borrowed from our garages. We didn't bring anything to protect ourselves. After all, it was just an old hospital, right? Just a building with a creepy history. Nothing more. As our lights swept across the walls, I couldn't help but notice the faded signs still hanging from the ceilings. They were remnants of a time long past, hospital departments like maternity ward and emergency room still visible, albeit worn and tattered. The corridors stretched out before us like a maze, each one more ominous than the last. We slowly made our way deeper into the building, moving through the dark hallways, our footsteps the only sound that broke the silence. With each step, the air seemed to grow heavier. My heart raced in my chest as I led the way, trying not to let my unease show. I knew that whatever we were about to uncover, it was not going to be as simple as just poking around an old building. There was something unsettling about the place. And I had no idea then, but we were about to encounter things that should have been left in the past. As we ventured further into the heart of the hospital, the sense of unease that had lingered outside began to intensify. The air felt thicker now, heavier, almost as though it were pressing against us. I kept telling myself it was just the dampness, the decay, the feeling that any old building gives off after years of abandonment. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, something was off. We had reached what looked like the main hallway. The floors were covered in layers of dust, footprints from previous explorers, or perhaps something else, marking their passage. The walls were lined with doors, some half open, others barely hanging on their hinges. There were no signs of life, of course, nothing but the occasional rat scurrying across the floor, but everything about the place screamed neglect. The silence here felt unnatural, too complete, like the building was holding its breath, waiting. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, feeling the chill of the air seep into my bones. Caleb, who was usually the first to crack a joke or make light of any situation, was unusually quiet. I glanced at him, but his expression mirrored my own, uneasy, yet determined to push forward. Luke, on the other hand, seemed more curious than anything. He was always the one to take things one step further, testing boundaries, finding answers to questions we didn't always ask. "You think it's safe to keep going?" Caleb muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but there was an edge to it that I hadn't heard before. I glanced at Luke, who seemed to be lost in thought as he stared down the hallway, his flashlight casting shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally on the walls. He didn't answer right away, and that only made the silence feel worse. "We're already here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Might as well see this through. We've come this far." It was true. We had already passed the threshold. Turning back now felt impossible. The pull of the unknown was too strong, and yet, with every passing second, I could feel the unease growing. We decided to head towards what looked like the old administration area, one of the few rooms that still had a door intact. The others had either been kicked down or rotted away completely. I led the way, my footsteps echoing in the hollow silence, the only sound in the hospital besides the occasional creak of the building settling. I tried to push the growing feeling of being watched from my mind, but I couldn't. It was there, hovering just behind my thoughts, like a shadow that refused to dissipate. As I reached for the handle of the door, something caught my eye. A flicker of movement down the corridor. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, my mind playing games with me. But then, it happened again quick, almost too fast for my eyes to register. A shadow, just a blur, slipping behind one of the doors. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice sharp, startling myself more than anyone else. Caleb turned to me, his face pale. "See what?" "I swear I saw something," I said, now feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Down the hallway. Luke was already moving, his curiosity piqued. Probably just a rat or something. "Let's check it out." We all followed Luke, albeit reluctantly, as he made his way toward the door where I'd seen the movement. The hallway felt even darker now, the flashlight beams barely penetrating the thick shadows that clung to the corners. My heart was pounding harder with each step, the sensation of something being just out of sight pressing on my chest. Luke reached the door first, pausing just before he pushed it open. He glanced back at us with a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's nothing. Just a broken window or something." Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, waiting for us to make our next move. My stomach twisted as I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing in the darkness behind us. Luke shoved the door open. It creaked loudly, making us all flinch. The room inside was just as decrepit as the rest of the building, filled with overturned furniture and old paperwork scattered across the floor. The room had once been a reception area, judging by the remains of a faded desk that was barely standing. But it wasn't the room itself that caught my attention. It was the feeling. There was something off about this place. The air seemed thicker here, like it was heavier with history or something else. The floor creaked beneath our feet as we stepped inside, the beams of our flashlights dancing over the cracked linoleum and the piles of debris. The faint smell of decay, that stale, musty odor, was more pronounced here, mixing with the scent of something metallic, something sour. Then we heard it. A faint sound, barely audible at first, like a whispering breeze. But there was no wind in here, not that we could feel. The sound didn't make sense. It wasn't coming from any particular direction, but it was everywhere. "What is that?" Caleb asked, his voice tense, eyes wide. I didn't know, but something about that sound, it didn't belong. It was too soft, too faint, as though it was coming from behind the walls, or maybe even from the floorboards beneath us. We stood frozen for a moment, our eyes darting around the room, trying to find the source of the noise. It wasn't until I stepped closer to one of the walls that I noticed something strange. There, scratched into the peeling paint of the wall, was a series of simple scratches, really like something had clawed at the surface. It wasn't anything I could easily recognize, just chaotic lines, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. "Are those claw marks?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Luke stepped up beside me, his face pale now. "Yeah, what the hell?" Caleb was already backing away, his hands shaking. "We need to get out of here." But Luke wasn't listening. He was too focused on the marks, on the strange symbols. "It's probably nothing, just kids messing around." But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had left those marks hadn't been human. There was something primal, something wrong about it. Then, just as we were about to turn to leave, the door behind us slammed shut. The sound was deafening, the force of it enough to rattle the windows. We all jumped, our hearts leaping in our throats. "What the hell?" Caleb yelled, his voice rising in panic. I grabbed the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked from the outside. We were trapped. The temperature in the room dropped, and a cold chill swept over us, causing our breaths to form visible clouds in the air. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel a knot tightening in my stomach. Something wasn't right. The strange whispers, the claw marks, the door slamming shut, none of it made sense. We weren't alone in here, and whatever was in this hospital with us wasn't interested in letting us leave. The air in the hospital was getting colder by the second. Each breath felt like it was coming from a place deep inside the earth, cold, unnatural. The door wouldn't budge no matter how hard I pulled. My hands were slick with sweat despite the icy chill that had taken over the room. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what was happening. Luke, ever the optimist, was already moving around the room, his flashlight darting from corner to corner as he muttered under his breath, "It's just a malfunction. There's a way out. There has to be." But Caleb and I weren't so sure. My mind kept flashing back to the scratches on the wall, the strange symbols that hadn't looked like anything I could understand. They seemed older, not something a person would carve on a whim, not in this place. "I don't like this," Caleb said, his voice shaking slightly. He was standing by the window now, pressing his hand against the glass, as if willing it to open. But the window was sealed shut, another layer of this place's decay. I couldn't help but glance at the door again, half expecting something to appear behind it. Or worse, for something to come from the walls themselves. We tried the door again, all of us pulling at the handle at once, but it didn't budge. A few moments passed, all of us standing still, silent. The stillness in the room was suffocating, like the entire building was holding its breath. I felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. "All right, we need to find another way out," Luke said, his voice more serious now. He wasn't trying to reassure us anymore. His usual bravado had given way to something else, something I couldn't quite name, but I knew I wasn't the only one feeling it. I turned and scanned the room, the light from our flashlights flickering across the walls. There were old filing cabinets in the corner, and some strange, weathered furniture scattered around. The ceiling was sagging in places, and I noticed a few dark streaks that looked like they might be mold. But it wasn't the room itself that made me uneasy. It was the growing sense of presence, the feeling that something was moving just out of sight. A sudden crash sounded from somewhere deeper within the building, startling all of us. We froze, the sound reverberating through the walls. It was too loud to be an animal. And it wasn't the wind, it was something far more deliberate. "Was that?" Caleb asked, his voice barely a whisper. But the question hung in the air, unanswered. Luke immediately turned and headed toward the hallway, his steps deliberate, too fast for my liking. I grabbed his arm, stopping him for a moment. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He shot me a quick glance, eyes wide with determination. "We need to find out what's happening here, don't we? We're not leaving until we understand this." His words sent a chill down my spine, but there was no denying the truth in them. I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling inside me. We couldn't just sit here. We needed to know. We left the room, making our way down the hallway toward the source of the sound. The flashlight beams trembled in the dark, casting long, shaky shadows that seemed to dance around us. The air felt oppressive now, as though the walls were closing in on us. As we passed through the hallway, I noticed something else. The walls. They weren't just peeling from age. Some sections of them were cracked, like they had been damaged from the inside out. I paused, my flashlight scanning over a particularly large crack, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't just a crack. It looked like something had clawed its way through. The edges were jagged and uneven, as though they had been torn apart from the inside. I wasn't sure whether I should keep looking or turn away, but I couldn't pull my gaze from it. "Did you see this?" I asked, my voice low. Luke was already ahead of me, oblivious to what I had just discovered. Caleb stepped up beside me, his eyes following mine. He didn't say anything at first, but I could see the confusion and fear in his expression. "What the hell is that?" I swallowed hard, feeling a wave of nausea roll through me. "I don't know. Maybe we're just seeing things. Maybe the walls are just old." But the cracks didn't look old. They looked recent, and that unsettled me more than anything. The hallway was stretching on forever. We hadn't seen a single exit, no windows, nothing that even remotely resembled a way out. My eyes darted from one dark corner to another, trying to shake the feeling that we were being watched. Then, a sound of faint creak. It came from behind us, from the farthest corner of the hallway. A scraping, dragging noise that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Caleb whipped around, eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" His voice cracked with panic. Before I could answer, there was a thud, something heavy falling to the floor, like a body hitting the ground. It wasn't the building settling. This was different. This was real. We rushed toward the noise, our footsteps echoing louder than they should. As we neared the end of the hallway, my flashlight beam caught something on the floor, something I wasn't ready to see. A shoe. A single, worn, scuffed shoe, lying discarded in the middle of the floor. It was too small to belong to any of us, too. Out of place. I reached down to pick it up, but a loud bang from the other side of the hallway made me jerk back. My heart skipped a beat, my body stiffening as I stood frozen in place. The flashlight beam flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, a figure, just out of the corner of my eye. It was dark, just a shadow, but it was there. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat, and that's when I saw it. The door at the end of the hall. It wasn't a door at all anymore, it was a hole. A jagged, gaping wound in the wall that hadn't been there before. Something had torn through it. We stood there for a long moment, all of us too frightened to move, too uncertain to turn away. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of our quickened breaths. But then came something worse, the unmistakable sound of a voice, muffled, distant, like it was coming from the other side of that door. It was calling to us. "Hello?" My voice cracked as I whispered the word, and I regretted it immediately. There was no answer, just the eerie sensation of something. Waiting. But there was no turning back now. Whatever had been hidden in this hospital for so long, whatever had been left behind, was no longer going to remain hidden. And we were the ones who had disturbed it. The cold air in the hallway grew denser, almost suffocating. Every breath felt heavier than the last, as though the atmosphere itself was thickening around us. I could barely hear my own thoughts over the pounding of my heart. Caleb, Luke, and I stood frozen in place, staring at the massive hole in the wall, the jagged, torn remnants of what had once been a door, a barrier now destroyed by something unseen. I felt the tension tightening around my chest, constricting my lungs. The silence, which had once been suffocating, was now unbearable. The weight of the unknown pressed down on us like a physical force, and for the first time since we'd stepped into this forsaken place, I truly regretted coming here. A faint whisper of movement came from within the hole. Not a voice, not something human, but a scraping, a dragging sound. Something or someone was coming through. I felt Caleb's hand clamp onto my arm, and I knew he was feeling the same sickening dread that was consuming me. We both turned to look at Luke, who had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came out. He didn't need to say anything for us to know what he was feeling. We were in over our heads. Whatever we'd stumbled upon in this crumbling building was beyond anything we had ever imagined. And then the silence was broken. A scream. It wasn't loud at first. It was distant, muffled, coming from behind that torn opening. A high-pitched, shrill wail that seemed to reverberate off the walls of the building. My blood ran cold. The sound wasn't human, not in the way a scream should be. It was jagged, unnatural, like it was being ripped from something deep and primal. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My hands trembled uncontrollably, but I couldn't bring myself to move. I couldn't look away from the hole. The darkness beyond it seemed to shift, to move, as though it were alive. "Do you hear that?" Caleb whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, though my throat was dry and tight. I couldn't speak. The sound had escalated, becoming louder, more desperate, more distorted. The noise twisted and warped, like someone or something was trying to claw its way into our world. My eyes darted around the hallway, trying to find something, anything that could explain what was happening. But there was nothing, just the sounds. Then a shadow crossed the hole. I didn't know what it was at first. It was dark, too dark to make out anything distinct, but it moved with an unnatural speed. The shadow didn't walk, it slid, as though it was floating just above the ground, tracing the edges of the opening. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could process what I had seen, it was gone. Just like that. Gone. "Luke, do you see it?" I whispered. Luke didn't answer at first. He was frozen in place, eyes wide, his flashlight flickering as he slowly raised it toward the hole. My heartbeat quickened. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't tear my eyes away either. And then it appeared. A figure, tall and thin, but twisted, deformed in a way that made my stomach churn. It was a silhouette at first, too dark to make out any features, but as it stepped closer to the opening, I could see something that made me freeze. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was a patchwork of skin, twisted and warped into a grotesque mask. Hollow eyes stared back at us, black as the void itself, and a mouth that opened wide in a scream that echoed through my bones. It wasn't human, not by any means. The figure stepped out of the darkness and into the dim light of the hallway, revealing more of its grotesque form. Its arms were impossibly long, fingers ending in sharp, jagged claws that scraped against the walls as it moved forward. It was moving slowly, deliberately, and it seemed to savor the terror that was radiating off of us. My mind screamed at me to run, to get the hell out of there, but my feet were glued to the floor. I couldn't move. I could only stare in horror as the thing approached. Get out of here." Caleb's voice barely registered in my mind. I turned to look at him, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. I had never seen him so scared in all the years I had known him. His voice cracked as he backed away, still not taking his eyes off the thing that was getting closer. But there was no way out, no way to escape. The thing reached out with one of its long, spindly arms, and I felt a sharp chill fill the air. The temperature had dropped even further, so much so that I could see my breath misting in front of me. I couldn't even think, only react. My legs moved of their own accord, taking a step backward, but I couldn't look away. I was rooted to the spot. "Run now!" Luke screamed, his voice hoarse, raw. But the thing didn't stop. It didn't seem to care that we were terrified. It wasn't acting out of malice. It was something far worse. It was like it was drawn to our fear, feeding off it. The sound of its claws scraping the floor echoed through the hallway as it came closer, each step slower, more deliberate than the last. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to escape, to leave before it was too late. But I couldn't. I felt frozen. Suddenly, the thing lunged. It didn't move like a human, didn't move like any creature I had ever seen. It was quick, too quick, and it was right in front of us before I had time to even process it. I felt a sharp pain on my arm, a deep, burning sensation as its claw-like hand grazed my skin, leaving a mark that burned like fire. But the pain wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the feeling of its touch, cold, slick, and wrong, as though it had no business being in this world. I screamed, jerking away from the thing, but its eyes locked onto mine, and I couldn't look away. The world seemed to spin around me, my thoughts turning to mush. My body moved, but my legs couldn't keep up. I stumbled, tripping over my own feet, my breath coming in shallow gasps. "Help! Please!" I shouted, but the words barely left my mouth before another ear-piercing scream filled the air, louder this time, filling the hallway with a deafening roar. It wasn't just the thing. It was the building. The walls seemed to be alive, groaning and creaking under some unseen pressure, as if the entire structure were about to collapse on top of us. I had to get out. And that's when I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. It was Luke. He had grabbed Caleb, and together they were dragging me toward the exit, pulling me away from the thing that was still advancing. We stumbled through the hallway, not daring to look back. My heart was in my throat, my legs aching, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't even think about stopping. The only thing I knew was that we had to get out. Now. We didn't look back. We couldn't. The cold air in the hallway had become unbearable, and the oppressive sense of dread clung to us like a thick, suffocating fog. As we bolted through the crumbling corridors, I couldn't tell if I was running from the thing or from the very place itself. Every step I took felt as though the building itself was trying to swallow me whole. I could hear Luke and Caleb's frantic footsteps behind me, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They were just as terrified as I was, but there was no time to think about that. There was only one thing on my mind: escape. I wasn't sure how much further we had to go, but I could feel the weight of the darkness pushing in from all sides, like the building was folding in on itself. We reached the stairwell, and for a split second, I thought we were free. But as I turned to glance back, I saw the silhouette of the thing hovering in the doorway at the end of the hall, watching us with those hollow black eyes. The sight of it nearly paralyzed me. My breath hitched in my throat, and for a moment, I thought I might faint right there. But Caleb's voice pierced the air, harsh and urgent. "Move! Keep moving!" He was already halfway up the stairs, shouting at me to hurry. I forced my legs to work, pushing myself up the stairs, my feet slipping on the worn, greasy steps. My pulse thundered in my ears as we ascended, but I couldn't hear anything beyond the rush of my own panic. All I could focus on was getting out, leaving the horror of the abandoned hospital behind. The higher we climbed, the more the building seemed to groan, as though the very structure was fighting to hold itself together. The walls creaked, the floorboards buckled underfoot, and the air grew thick with dust and mildew. I could barely see in front of me, the dim light from our flashlights flickering in and out as we ascended, adding to the sense of unreality that was closing in. When we reached the top floor, the door leading out was locked. I slammed my hand against the door in frustration, the realization dawning on me that we were trapped. A panic surged within me, but Luke quickly moved to the side, reaching for something on the wall beside the door. There, in the corner of the old building, was a rusty fire exit. "Here," he yelled, his voice strained. "This should work. It's our only shot." Caleb and I rushed to his side, both of us holding our breath as Luke wrestled with the fire exit. The door groaned, the metal hinges protest, but after what felt like an eternity, it finally creaked open. Cold, fresh air greeted us, filling our lungs with a sense of relief that I had never known before. Without a word, we shoved through the door and into the alleyway outside. The night air hit me like a wave, and for the first time in hours, I could breathe. I could feel my legs shaking beneath me as I stumbled away from the hospital's dark, oppressive shadow, each step taking me further from the terror we had just escaped. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. Once we were safely inside the car, I leaned back in the seat, trying to steady my breath. My body was trembling, my heart still racing, but I couldn't find the words to speak. I didn't know what to say. Did you see it too?" Caleb's voice was hoarse, almost as though he were asking for reassurance. I could see the fear still etched on his face, his eyes wide and unblinking, as though he were still seeing that thing in the shadows. I nodded, unable to say anything at first. I couldn't shake the image of its hollow eyes, the way it had moved, its skin stretched and contorted into something inhuman. It was still burned into my memory, and I knew it would be for a long time. The images of the thing would haunt me, whether I liked it or not. Luke was the next to speak, his voice quiet but urgent. "What the hell was that? What did we just see?" We all turned to look at him, and I could see the same question in his eyes. What had we encountered in that hospital? What had that thing been? And how had it been able to follow us so easily, so effortlessly? None of us had any answers. We need to go to the police," Caleb finally said. His voice trembled, and he ran a hand through his hair. "We need to tell someone. They can't just leave that place standing there." But I wasn't sure what we'd even tell them. How could we explain what had happened? How could we describe that creature, the thing we had seen, without sounding like we were losing our minds? And even if we did, would anyone believe us? The building had been abandoned for years, and there was no evidence of anything out of the ordinary, at least, not that anyone would be able to find. I stared out of the window, watching as the lights of the city flickered in the distance. It was almost as though the world outside was trying to move on, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. The horrors of that night weren't just going to disappear. I would never forget what I had seen, what we had all seen. The ride back to town was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. My mind kept returning to that place, the hospital, the thing that had chased us. But there was something else lingering in my mind too, something that I couldn't shake off. As much as I wanted to convince myself that we were safe, that the nightmare was over, I couldn't. There was something off, something wrong about the whole experience. When we finally arrived at Caleb's place, we barely spoke. I couldn't bring myself to look at him or Luke. I didn't want to think about what had happened, what we had just escaped. All I wanted was to forget, to put the entire experience out of my mind. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. The truth was, that hospital wasn't just haunted by memories, it was haunted by something else. Something that hadn't been human for a long, long time. And I wasn't sure we had left it behind. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to go about my life as usual, to shake off the feeling of dread that still lingered in my bones. But it wasn't easy. There were nights when I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of that thing's scream echoing in my ears. Sometimes, when I would close my eyes, I could almost feel its eyes on me, watching me from the shadows. I didn't speak to Caleb or Luke much after that night. We all needed space. But I knew deep down I would never forget what we had seen. The images, the fear, the horrible realization that there are things in this world we can't explain. Things that should remain hidden, buried, forgotten. But they don't always stay buried. And I knew one thing for sure, there was something still out there. Something that hadn't finished with us yet. It wasn't over. It's been weeks since we escaped that hospital, but the unease still gnaws at me every day. You would think that with time, the terror would fade, that I would be able to shake the images from my mind. But no matter how much I try to move on, something about that place, something about what we saw, continues to haunt me. I still have trouble sleeping. The nights are the worst. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can feel the weight of the air in that dark hallway pressing against my chest. I hear the sound of the thing's movements, the dragging noise of its unnatural body against the floor, its steady, deliberate approach. And when I wake up in a panic, drenched in sweat, I have to remind myself that I'm no longer there. But the fear remains, constant and suffocating. I've tried to talk about it. I've tried to tell people what happened, but no one believes me. Everyone just brushes it off as a nightmare, a bad experience. Even Caleb and Luke, my two closest friends, don't bring it up anymore. We barely speak to each other now. It's like that night was too much for all of us to process. So, we've all gone our separate ways. It's easier that way, I suppose. Pretend it never happened. Pretend we're normal. But it's not that simple. That place. I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, still waiting for someone else to wander in. I can't stop wondering what the thing was. It didn't feel like a ghost, or at least not the kind of ghost you read about in books. It was more malevolent, more intelligent, as if it had purpose. And if it wanted us gone, why didn't it just finish the job? Why let us leave? I can't stop thinking about the unanswered questions, the things we'll never understand. I still drive by the old hospital sometimes, even though I know it's been abandoned for years. But it's different now. It feels wrong, as if the building itself is aware of me, watching me. The windows are dark, no light filtering through, no movement inside. But I can't help but feel a strange pull, an invisible thread that draws me back to it. And whenever I pass by, I feel a shiver race down my spine. It's almost as if the building is calling me, daring me to return, to face whatever is hiding inside. But I know better. I know the dangers of curiosity. After everything we experienced, I can't let myself go back there. Whatever that thing was, it's not something I want to confront again. I've come to terms with the fact that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that shouldn't be disturbed. Some doors should remain closed, no matter how much temptation or curiosity tugs at your soul. The hardest part of it all, though, is the uncertainty. We never told anyone about what happened. We never went to the authorities, never reported what we saw. I don't know if we even could have, who would believe us. The hospital was a rundown, forgotten place, and any investigation into its past would likely turn up nothing. It would have been a wild goose chase. And even if we had reported it, what would the police have done? There's no physical evidence of what we encountered, no signs of violence or wrongdoing. No, the only thing we have is the memory of that thing, and memories are fleeting. They fade with time, and people forget. But I haven't forgotten. I don't think I ever will. And the scariest part? I think that thing knows that. I know it sounds crazy, but sometimes, when I close my eyes, when I'm alone in the dark, I feel a presence. It's not tangible, not something I can touch, but it's there, watching, waiting. It's as if whatever we encountered is still following me, lingering just beyond the edge of my awareness. I've tried to ignore it, to tell myself it's just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. That thing, that creature, is still out there. And it's not finished with me. A few days ago, I drove past the old hospital again. I couldn't help it. I needed to see it one more time. But when I got close, I saw something strange. The front gates were wide open. They hadn't been that way before. I stopped the car on the side of the road, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. There was no reason for the gates to be open. The building had been locked up tight, abandoned for years. And yet, here I was, staring at the open gates, knowing full well that I shouldn't go any closer. My heart raced in my chest, and I was torn. Part of me wanted to drive away, to keep my distance, to leave that cursed place behind for good. But the other part of me, the part that still couldn't let go of the mystery, wanted to turn the car around and see what lay beyond those gates. I didn't go in. In the end, I drove off, but the decision wasn't easy. It never is when you're dealing with something that unsettles you on such a deep, primal level. The temptation, the curiosity, is always there. And I know that if I were to turn back, I'd find the answers I've been seeking. But I also know that I'd be opening a door that's better left shut. Some things in life are better left unexplored, especially when the consequences of digging too deep can be far worse than anything you could imagine. So for now, I'll live with the uncertainty. I'll live with the fear, the lingering sense of unease that follows me wherever I go. But I won't go back. Not to that hospital, and certainly not to face whatever waits inside. The truth is, I've learned something from this experience. There are places in this world where the veil between the living and the dead is thinner than we realize. There are things that shouldn't be disturbed, things that are best left forgotten. And sometimes, no matter how much we want to uncover the mysteries, it's better to let them remain buried. Because some answers are worse than the questions. And some doors should never be opened.